Um, I've long said that I have a job working for International Crisis Group, and that keeps me busy, but I get dragged back into the past every so often because of work I've done separately in the past, and this is one such occasion. Talking about chemical warfare for me is a hobby, I'm afraid, and not what I normally do. And it's a hobby that's still very much alive, because when I first did when I first became involved in the issue was in the 1990s, looking at what happened during the Iran-Iraq War, and documented that and wrote a book about it. But I very much thought and hoped that after that war and the creation of the Chemical Weapons Convention, that the issue would have been put to bed, that the norm would have been strengthened again, because the previous use of chemical weapons on a mass scale was in the First World War. So between the First World War and the Iran-Iraq War, we didn't see any significant use of chemical weapons in the battlefield, and so it was a shock to see that once again in Syria in the last few years we've seen repeated use of chemical weapons. And I think it's really important that we address this issue head on and not let it go away, because the future battlefield, if we don't take steps now, will again see use of these kinds of weapons and other equally insidious kinds of weapons, such as biological weapons and whatnot. So what I want to talk about today, though, is about investigating chemical weapons, allegations of chemical weapons attacks, and the kind of the fog of war notion that it's sometimes very difficult to figure out what is going on, and how political actors manipulate that information in order to cover up what has happened for their own purposes, and how that translates into policy decisions that rather than addressing the issue of chemical weapons use, can make it worse. And I want to talk a little bit about how to reaffirm that norm down the line. So in a perfect world, when there is a crime, you would expect a punishment. For the sake of justice, and for the sake that people understand that justice has been done, or is seen to be done, this is of key importance. But we're not in a perfect world, and so many crimes do, in fact, go unpunished. In an imperfect world, even if a crime goes unpunished, we would still want to establish the facts of what happened. The establishment of facts is important because it is the first step towards finding a way to address the justice question. But it's also important in terms of figuring out how to prevent a recurrence of that type of crime. And so even if no justice is done, I think it's important to look at ways of using the available information to come to some kind of preventive mechanism. Because if there is no condemnation whatsoever, again, apart from assigning individual culpability, then the perpetrators get out of jail free card, but also you create an environment of impunity. And in that environment, repeat behavior is very likely, and escalation is certainly very likely. And if we look at the Iran-Iraq War, and we see that Saddam Hussein's forces started using chemical weapons in 1983 on a very limited scale, and then when he noticed that there was no response, he started escalating the use of mustard gas and chlorine gas early on, and then moved into, and that was a precedent in world history, he moved into the use of nerve agents on the battlefield, and eventually more and more lethal types, and then on a more massive scale, and then not only targeting Iranian military forces, but also civilians. So why does it matter? Why focus on chemical weapons? Why are they so special? Are they worse than other weapons of war? This is a live debate within the military community and elsewhere. And I think that for a regime that feels that it is involved in an existential struggle, it doesn't matter what weapons it uses. And I would argue that today in Syria, while we have seen chemical weapons used by the regime and by the Islamic State, any of the actors would use chemical weapons if they had the capability. or not any, but many of them would, simply because they feel threatened in their existence, and would use any means at their disposal, be it chemical weapons or other means, to survive, and then of course also to vanquish their opponent. And for victims, chemical weapons, you can argue, are just as bad as when you were being bombed in an indiscriminate fashion with, say, barrel bombs. But I understand that in the case of chemical weapons, there are specific properties that affect children more in particular. But there's also the added effect that chemical weapons often are not as particularly effective in their lethality, but are particularly effective in causing changes in human behavior, in the sense that they are a weapon of terror primarily. And people have an instinctive reaction to them, and so on the battlefield and in civilian areas where maybe combatants are hiding, you can shape the behavior of the population in a way that would help you in fighting your battle more effectively. But I think most importantly, there is a real risk with chemical weapons, generally considered a weapon of mass destruction, with proliferation. And so when one actor discovers how particularly effective a weapon is, then others are going to try to manufacture the same weapons, and before you know it, you're in a regional cycle of proliferation, and then it becomes very difficult to put the genie back into the bottle. And so what is very important in this case is to establish a norm against a particular weapon, as we have norms against nuclear weapons, even though they haven't been banned, of course, against biological weapons, against blinding laser weapons, against landmines, now anti-personnel landmines, against cluster munitions, and also against chemical weapons. But these bans need to be, these norms need to be supported. They need to be maintained. They require constant maintenance, because there are always attempts at eroding them. And so I wanted to give you two examples. One, and I call it the tale of two fictions, because there were two chemical attacks that took place, one during the Iran-Iraq War. I mean, there were many during the Iran-Iraq War, but I want to focus on this one. It was the biggest one, in the case of Halabja, a Kurdish town of several thousand people, where several thousand, tens of thousands of people, where an Iraqi chemical attack on March 16th of 1988 killed, nobody really knows the exact number, but the sort of accepted number is 5,000 people, and it was not the first, but it was certainly the first major chemical attack on a city. So there were very few combatants in the area. The second one is an attack that took place on the town of Khan Sheikhoun in Syria on 4th of April of this year. Again, a civilian area, no combatants around at the time of the attack, or there was no fighting going on in any case, even if there were combatants. And some 100 people were killed. Again, the numbers are not entirely clear. So smaller than Halabja, but it doesn't matter, because it's the matter of principle that is really at play here. So I want to talk about the cover stories, the fictions that were created in order to cover it up. And in both cases, in the Halabja attack and the Khan Sheikhoun attack, the regimes denied that they were in any way involved, the Syrian regime in Khan Sheikhoun and the Iraqi regime in Halabja. Interestingly, so they just flatly denied it and they blamed the other side. Interestingly, it was the sponsor of the perpetrator who came up with the cover story. So in the Iraq case, in Halabja, it was the United States that went to bat for the Iraqi regime, claiming that, in fact, the attack had not taken place the way it was described in the media, because there were journalists who went and visited Halabja, but that, in fact, the attack had not been carried out by the Iraqi regime, or that maybe the Iraqi regime had been involved, but that Iranian forces had also used chemical weapons in Halabja. And by diffusing responsibility for the attack, they managed to delay an international response through the United Nations. Eventually, it took 2 months before there was a United Nations Security Council resolution on what had happened. And in the resolution, the condemnation was against both Iraq and Iran for using chemical weapons, once again, in the Iran-Iraq war. In all my research, I've never found evidence that Iran used chemical weapons during the Iran-Iraq war, let alone in Halabja. So you can imagine that if you are, and wherever you stand politically, but that if you're a belligerent and you get condemned by the United Nations Security Council for using chemical weapons, when in fact you didn't use it, that must grate. G-R-A-T-E. So the once the cover story came out, which was in the case of Halabja concocted by the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA, and then broadcast through the State Department, then the moment it came out, the Iraqi regime parroted exactly that line. Suddenly a week later, the Iraqis knew exactly what had happened in Halabja, and it happened to be exactly what the State Department said had happened. And how did the DIA come up with that information? How did they justify it? Well, they had their own research, of course, and intelligence agencies usually don't disclose their sources and methods, but there was an indication that they had used certain expertise, and later in my research I interviewed these people, and at the DIA and the people they were using as experts, and it turned out they were not experts at all. They were people who were exposed to the facts in some way and interpreted them in a certain way, sometimes without any kind of malice involved. But because of their actual lack of expertise, they drew the wrong conclusions. And this was then used in a way by, in this case, the DIA, to argue that in fact Iran had used chemical weapons because the United States was supporting Iraq or was tilting toward Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war. It was certainly opposed to Iran. Now, at the same time, the United Nations, not through the Security Council, but under the Secretary General, had sent missions of experts to Iraq and Iran to investigate claims which had been accumulating for years. Because, again, 1983 was the first use, Halabja was 5 years later. So throughout this period, the Iraqi forces were using chemical weapons, and the Iranians were appealing to the UN to investigate. And the Secretary General, with some risk to his reputation, agreed to it. And every single report of the United Nations missions that investigated this came to the conclusion, first, that chemical weapons were used, and second, identified the kind of chemical, but third, did not indicate the perpetrator, because that was not part of its remit, its mandate. And so the UN wasn't going to stick out its neck by indicating who was, they thought it was responsible. But if you read these reports, which are technical, expert, scientifically based reports, you can come to the conclusion pretty quickly that they know what they're talking about, and that in fact they were pointing their finger at one particular side of the conflict. But it was never explicitly stated. And this, again, made it possible to delay any kind of international political response to the crime, and therefore no punishment. Now, the second case is Khan Sheikhoun. So this took place, an attack on April 4th of this year in the town of Khan Sheikhoun, which is on the highway from Damascus to Aleppo, and was at the time, and still is, under rebel control. And so it was already had been for a number of days under sporadic attack by the regime Air Force. And on the 4th of April, in the early hours of the morning, an airplane took off from a nearby military base and threw chemical munition down on the town, which landed in the middle of a road, caused a small crater, and spread poisonous gas, which, like in the case of Halabja, by coincidence or otherwise, turned out to be this sarin, a highly lethal, non-persistent nerve agent that is odorless, tasteless, and invisible. And it's therefore a particular fairly nefarious way of killing, and you can see why such a weapon would instill fear and terror in civilian populations. Now, nothing happened after that right away, except that within hours, not the Syrian regime, but the Russian government and the Russian Defense Ministry came out with a statement saying that, in fact, yes, an attack had taken place with Syrian aircraft on the town of Khan Sheikhoun, not in the early morning hours, but 5 hours later, something like that. Rather than dropping a chemical munition, the plane had dropped a bomb on what turned out to be an arms cache of the rebels, in which chemical munitions were kept. And as a result of the explosion, there was a toxic gas that spread, and this is what killed the people in Khan Sheikhoun. And then the Syrian regime sort of parroted that story. It actually had a minor diversion from that, and then it took off. The confusion, and then this was supported by people who, in journalism, like Seymour Hersh and other people, who sort of took up that story and claimed that this wasn't the Syrian regime that was involved, but in fact it was the rebels whose own chemical stock had gone up in smoke, literally. So. But at the same time, as the Discover story was being aired, which again diffused the pressure to have an international response. First of all, the United States took a unilateral response by striking the airport from which the plane had departed with missiles. But the United Nations did nothing, except that, once again, there was an investigation. At this point, unlike in 1988, there is now an agency called the OPCW that was set up under the Chemical Weapons Convention to investigate allegations. And the OPCW did its research. Then the UN actually had a separate research. And in both cases, they came to the conclusion that the chemical gas, and they have irrefutable evidence of it, was sarin gas. And they concluded on the basis of that, but again, you won't see it in those reports, that because sarin is only in the hands of the Syrian regime, and it was an air-delivered, probably an air-delivered weapon, even though eyewitnesses are clear it was air-delivered, that the regime must have been the guilty party. Now, just a few days ago, or a couple of weeks ago, a joint investigation by the OPCW and the UN came out with a report in which they did identify the perpetrator. And this was the first time, not the first time in the Syria conflict, but certainly compared to the Iraq conflict, this was a major step forward. And it made categorically clear that it was the Syrian regime that had carried out the attack. But of course, also the mandate of the called JIM, the Joint Investigative Mechanism, was up for renewal, and the Russians vetoed it, so that we can be sure that there will be no future investigations of this sort in Syria. Still, attempts are being made to renew its mandate, but we'll have to see. To conclude, we have two investigations. We have two chemical attacks. We have categorical conclusions that a certain actor was culpable in the attack. We don't see justice done in the case of the Iraqi regime at the time or the Syrian regime at the moment. The sponsors of these regimes in the short term want these regimes to survive. That is the top priority. At the same time, these are global actors, the United States and Russia. And they have an interest in non-proliferation. In fact, both countries are signatories to the Chemical Weapons Convention, and they certainly don't want to see chemical weapons proliferation in the Middle East. And so they have acted against their own interests, strategic interests, by coming up with these fictions in these two cases. But it also, because if we look at the Iraq case, it was after the war, and the war ended months after the Halabja attack, that the United States put its political capital on drafting the Chemical Weapons Convention. In other words, once the regime had survived against the Iranians, then the United States found it was comfortable enough that it could now work on its larger strategic question of non-proliferation. And my assumption is that once the Russians are confident that the regime in Syria has survived, and it's already well on its way in that direction, then Russia might come around and help reinforce yet again the ban against chemical weapons, because even Russia has no interest in other states in the Middle East or elsewhere in the world using chemical weapons and sharing precursor chemicals and technology and know-how. So the emphasis and our objective ought to be to work on this in the international sphere, to convince all the signatories of the Chemical Weapons convention to reaffirm the norm and to make sure that future violations will be prevented. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So next, I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Omar Dawachi. He is an assistant professor of anthropology, social medicine, global health, and co-director of the conflict medicine program at the American University of Beirut. And he comes to us today from Lebanon. Trained as a physician in Iraq during the 1990s, he received his doctorate in social anthropology from Harvard University in 2008. Dawachi has conducted extensive archival and ethnographic research on human and ecological impacts of decades of Western interventions and violence in Iraq and the broader Middle East. His book with Stanford University Press, Ungovernable Life, Mandatory Medicine and Statecraft in Iraq, is the first study documenting the untold story of the rise and fall of state medicine in Iraq. He's currently conducting ethnographic research on the ecologies of wounds and wounding that explores the biosocial life of war wounds across the Middle East. He's author of numerous publications that have appeared in a number of medical, anthropological, and global health journals, including The Lancet. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me again here at Brown. I'm always excited to come back and see many friends and colleagues. I'm very grateful to Nargis for putting together this really timely conference, and also thinking about engaging this conversation beyond the academic sphere and beyond the academic walls. So my presentation's title today is Dirty Wounds, Iraqi Bacter and the Ecologies of War in the Middle East. And what I want to do over the next 20 minutes, I will try to address some of these questions of toxicity and war through my own research, and raise maybe broader kind of both empirical and theoretical conversations on this issue. So to give you a little bit of a background, I'm basically I'm a trained, as I was introduced, I'm a trained physician and an anthropologist. I've been mostly interested. My work has been focusing on the decades of the effects of the decades of the U.S. interventions in Iraq. I myself have trained in Iraq in the 1990s during the first Gulf, in the aftermath of the first Gulf War and the sanctions, and I also kind of came of age in during the Iran-Iraq War as a teenager, and actually the transition from high school also to medical school was also a transition from one mode of war to another mode of war. Eventually, I ended up leaving Iraq. I escaped Iraq in the 1990s and ended up in Beirut and for a few years, and came to the United States to study anthropology. My entry to the U.S. was 1 month before the events of 9/11. And from Cambridge and Boston, I had to kind of witness the escalation of yet another war through my own kind of lifetime, and this time not really being in Iraq, but actually looking at Iraq from a remote place. So for me, the interesting question of ground zero is not where is ground zero, but when is ground zero? In a place like Iraq and any of these ongoing conflicts in the Middle East, I think the focus on the historical and processes of war need to be very much in our thinking when we are examining events like, let's say, war in general as such. So, and at the core of my research has been an attempt to document this kind of historical, public health, medical, and ethnographic questions around the impact of these wars in Iraq. And so in my recent book, Ungovernable Life, I've tried to address the problem of the collapse of Iraq's healthcare, and that was very much associated with also the collapse of the state in Iraq. This relationship between medicine or state medicine in Iraq and the breakdown of the state was, for me, was very fascinating, partly because I worked in there as a doctor and knew how central medicine and healthcare was to the making of the state, and to also, obviously, to the unmaking of it. So the book was trying to really kind of one of the main arguments is to show how healthcare and has been always a platform for empires and states and post-colonial regimes in projects of governance, and also looking at kind of how health was almost one of the central pillars of making states in the Middle East. And I think this argument could also be seen in a place like Syria. So understanding health is very much linked to understanding the state in many of these countries. One of the other kind of main themes that I addressed and eventually became more and more interesting for me is the emergence of this discourse of the ungovernability of Iraq that I tried to address in the book. So one of the fascinating parts is this discourse that eventually proliferated in political commentaries and even in academic circles around the incommensurability of the state in Iraq because of the different sectarian backgrounds or communitarian identities, or because of the militarization of Iraq, or because of the presence of an authoritarian regime. And for someone who grew up in Iraq for more than 25 years, these were, a lot of them were somewhere far away from the reality of everyday life. In a place like Iraq, state institutions and social welfare and professional training were central to the history of the state, to the making of the state. And these were sometimes very disturbingly kind of absent when people spoke about Iraq and wrote about it, most of the times without really empirical understanding of the place. Iraq has been closed also since the 1950s from Western researchers, so we haven't had really a lot of empirical work going on in Iraq during that time. So most of the people who wrote about Iraq, benefited from the discursive turn in history and anthropology to look at the discourses of the regime and looking at the Ba'ath Party ideologies, and or use the British archives and colonial archives to kind of have some kind of an understanding of present-day Iraq. And what I tried to kind of show in the book is that there is another kind of field of understanding of Iraq that was completely missing from that literature. Now, the other kind of question is this notion of ungovernability. So I wasn't really kind of also trying to undermine the use of this word of the ungovernability in Iraq, but also to use it as an analytic to think about the unraveling of power in Iraq in the post-U.S. interventions, but also throughout a history of colonial and post-colonial state-making. And I'm mentioning this also because it will become clearer as I go on why this is an interesting kind of analytic. So Iraq kind of presents an important, I think, insight to what is going on in the Middle East right now with the collapsing of state infrastructures of countries and states that had actually very developed healthcare systems, like Syria, even Libya. You can see that there, and what does it mean really to live in this kind of environment, this ecology of state collapse, of state infrastructure collapse, and of course with the displacement of many of the country's populations moving from professionals to people coming from all different backgrounds. So my talk today, I aim to kind of do two things. I have two main kind of arguments. I would like to draw attention to the questions of the environmental scale of toxicity. And I would like here to go also a little bit beyond the focus on, let's say, chemical weapons or international humanitarian law, and or the use of controversial weapons like, let's say, depleted uranium. And I think these are very, very central, but I think we need to also think about toxicity in a much more broader scale. So I will focus in this talk on the emergence of a multi-drug resistant bacteria, which is called Acinetobacter baumannii, that is basically called Iraqi bacter by the US military surgeons who worked in Iraq. And this is one of the most devastating superbugs affecting wounded populations and affecting also healthcare settings. It has been reported now around different conflict settings in the Middle East, and the danger of this toxicity of this bug has been because this rising resistance to most of the antibiotics that we've been using to treat infection, and there is the only antibiotic left that is to treat it is called colistin, which is an antibiotic that has been abandoned in the 1970s because of its actual toxicity to the kidneys. So the revival of old drugs for new wars is a common phenomena that I've been kind of investigating and looking at. And what is fascinating about what is going on is that there is what they call in epidemiology a sentinel event. The rise of resistance to this remaining antibiotic has a lot of significant implications for the future, and I'll come to talk about that in a bit. So what I will try to speak the second point I want to raise is really kind of bring in the role of ethnography. And specifically in medical anthropology, to think about these really important medical questions, global health questions, questions about war and toxicity, and by telling the story of how we came to understand some of the connections of this Iraqi bacter to war, I would like to kind of bring in also this argument that we in anthropology kind of build on a lot, is at least in medical anthropology, that ethnography is always this almost signal detection approach, or signal detection kind of tool sometimes of understanding what is going on the ground before, let's say, it gets picked up by global and public health research, or being something that is at the center of the global health community. And so what I will talk about mostly is this mystery of the Iraqi bacter. So in the post-2003 occupation of Iraq, British and U.S. Military surgeons began reporting on a deadly superbug that they called an invisible enemy. They called it blood insurgents. They used all these insurgency kind of discursive epistemologies to describe this infection that has been plaguing a lot of the wounded in the Iraq War. And so it was called Iraqi bacter as it has hit the troops in the Middle East. It caused sepsis, pneumonia, and also it mostly affected these open wounds that were being treated in field hospitals, and were also transferred and moved with the soldiers all the way through the evacuation pathways of the military. So it started appearing in military hospitals in the US and moving also into civilian hospitals, and killing many individuals and immunosuppressant patients living here in the United States. So and of course this bacteria has historically been not a very pathogenic bacteria. It's existed in the environment, it existed on skin, it existed in soil, but there has been historically reports of its resistance to antibiotics over the 1980s and the 1990s. However, during the post-2003, it seems to be emerging, or at least we become more aware of it in a much more endemic state in places like Iraq, and soon it begins to appear in many other places, or at least its diagnosis begins to make sense in places like Yemen, Syria, and even Afghanistan, although less in Afghanistan than in Iraq. So the fascinating thing about this bacteria is that when it's also talked about in the U.S. media, there's been a couple of New York Times articles on it. There's been reporting on Nova with Neil deGrasse Tyson. The one quote here, for example, this scientist says, "In many respects, it's far worse than MERS. There are strains out there, and they are becoming more and more common, that are resistant to virtually every antibiotic we have." When you begin to read about how it's been described, it's almost like the ISIS of bacteria. This is the kind of the evolution of something that is affecting all the troops and affecting the blood. They are the insurgents, the invisible insurgents in Iraq. Now, what is fascinating about this bacteria, that indeed it's a very peculiar type of bacteria that has evolved into forming what they call a biofilm. And the biofilm here is a kind of a way where this bacteria attaches to each other and exchange information about the resistance. So if one cell has acquired the resistance through a certain process, it actually sends that information to other bacteria, and that makes it makes all the bacteria resistant. And the bacteria seems to be also not necessarily the U.S. military. The reports of the U.S. military was also not really talking about its widespread in other settings across the Middle East. So one of the things that we began seeing is it's appearing in Beirut, where I started doing my research on wounded civilians and combatants coming to Beirut for treatment, specifically Iraqis and Syrians. And what we see was the widespread of these infections in many of the cases coming into Beirut, and these wounded civilians and combatants were dealing with a much broader ecology that has been helping to, like we can understand, helping to proliferate these infections. And some of them have to do with the increasing civilian casualties in war, has to do with the use of new weaponries. So all of these changing ecologies were very central to rethinking why is this bacteria emerging in this point of time, what is really the historical trajectory of it, and where is this problem going. So in Beirut, we started seeing these infections also in relationship to the increase in the number of Iraqis who are coming to the hospital for treatment. So in 2007, this is when a lot of the documentation of this bacteria begins to appear in Beirut, and this has to do a lot with the numbers of Iraqis who came to Beirut during that specific moment of time. This is immediately after the Civil War and the counterinsurgency operations that happened in 2006 and 2007, and also at the same time, our work there was showing that with a lot of humanitarian hospitals, like the famous MSF hospital in Amman, that has been doing mostly reconstructive surgery for Iraqi, Syrian, and Yemeni patients, that they have been also reporting high rates of this infection. And why is this significant? In the past year, the UN General Assembly announced that antimicrobial resistance is going to become the new epidemic. That is that needs political collaboration around responding to this. We are now coming to a place where it's projected that in 2050, close to 10 million people might be affected by antimicrobial resistance. Actually, might even die from that condition. And you can see from some of these projected numbers how is that different from the other kind of conditions. I'm going a little bit fast because I was told I have 5 minutes. But anyway, so this, the bigger event here, or the bigger problem, is the question of the end of antibiotics. Why is this an important question? Is that the ability of bacteria to react to the antibiotics used to kill it is almost like reacting to the chemical weapons that have been bombarded by. The Syrian Civil War has been kind of announced. That's could be one of the reasons like we are kind of approaching the end of antibiotics. Now, this is something that are other issues related to the end of antibiotics that I could more than happy to discuss. But I'm just kind of leading to this this moment. So one of the things that pushed us now at the conflict medicine program is to begin thinking about some of these questions, empirical questions on the ground. So we've begun to come together to think about different ways of investigating some of these problems. So from the work that we started on looking at wounds and injuries and movements of populations, we began now putting together a huge project that involves laboratory work, historians of science, clinical and molecular epidemiologists, who are really kind of coming together to think about the history and the emergence and the different aspects of this Acinetobacter problem. One of the hypotheses that we have been looking at is that this bacteria might be mutating. One of the reasons this mutation is the presence of heavy metals, in the increasing presence of heavy metals in the environment. So it's been documented in agricultural and industrial literature of the increasing problems that are related to this increased sensitivity of this bacteria when it is really exposed to these heavy metals. The other problems is this bacteria really just a hospital-based bacteria or is a community-based bacteria? What the U.S. military surgeons were insisting that this is a nosocomial infection. That means it's a bacteria that proliferates within the hospital. There is now a lot of evidence or suspicion that this might actually be coming from the community. And I think this is one important question that will need to be investigated. The other kind of main political determinant here or driver has been the role of the U.S.-led international sanctions on Iraq. And the sanctions were very instrumental in transforming antibiotics practices in the country during that period. Antibiotics were put on the dual use of weaponry. And so that means that antibiotics had to be approved by the UN before entering the country. And then for more than 12 years, Iraq used broad-spectrum antibiotics to deal with the broken down infrastructure and the effect of that on the patients. So just to conclude, I think the toxicity of war is something that has to do with a much longer history of war. We need to see the effect of toxicity through a broader scale, through historical, for more of a longue durée perspective. And I think the role here of us as researchers and maybe activists is to kind of get down to the ground and and begin to think in a much broader way of how we can really address these questions empirically. It's not an easy task in a place like Iraq, where research is also becoming increasingly impossible with the political situation. However, there are always ways to think about work on these issues that could bring in interdisciplinary work, empirical work together to try to highlight a much longer history of toxicity and the changing of the environment in these places. What is really at stake here is that this is something that is affecting the genetic makeup not only of humans but also of non-humans. And then what we see is, in terms of epigenetics, the effect of these toxicities will haunt a lot of the intergenerational. It will be kind of carried in intergenerationally and affecting these places, and sometimes in an irreversible way. Thank you very much. So apologize, I've been with jet lag today.
Great. Thank you both. So I will start off actually with a couple of questions for each of you, and then open it up to the audience to ask additional questions over this next half hour of the panel. So first, actually, for Mr. Justilterman, as an emergency physician myself, I know that during chemical attacks in warfare, the role of first responders, medical personnel, is first and foremost to treat the victims, to save lives, and to reduce suffering. But to what extent do you think it is also part of the role of these first responders to act as advocates, to raise attention to the issue, or should they stay more neutral and stick to just providing medical care? And what are sort of the problems with both sides of that?
Thanks, Adam, for the question. So in the two cases I described, first responders played a role in the Syria case, not so much in the Iraq case, but in the case of Iraq, we ended up also with 2 MSF doctors going to this site within days of the attack, and they were advocates. In the case of Syria, MSF played a critical role in terms of being first responders because they actually had a clinic on the ground and treated a number of the patients. But their advocacy role was different there. So, and there were other first responders in the Syria case, other doctors, clinics, not related to MSF, so local. So first of all, yes, they should treat the victims, and we can only hope that they have the right knowledge about the type of chemicals being used in these cases to provide the right treatment, to make the right diagnosis, and then to provide the right treatment. And we've seen, for example, repeatedly in conflicts where chemical weapons, or in locations where chemical weapons haven't been used, that medical personnel simply don't know what they're dealing with, and therefore don't treat patients the correct way. And so you can see videos of how patients are being treated, and then immediately there are people who say, well, clearly then it wasn't a chemical attack because look, the doctors were not treating the patients well. But actually it was because the doctors didn't necessarily know how to treat, also because they misdiagnosed maybe. In terms of advocacy, we have to be very careful. I think what is critical is for medical personnel and first responders in general is to document and to keep a very close record of what they see and what they do. So if, for example, if you find a patient and you think that a nerve agent was used and you administer atropine, for example, and it works, that is an important fact. That doesn't mean you should go out and say the Syrian regime just attacked us. as a first responder, as a medical, you don't necessarily want to stick your neck out politically. You endanger yourself, your patients, and your facilities. But to have that information is critically important, because when the investigation does take place by parties that are mandated to do so, then that information is critical. And that, in fact, in the case of Khan Sheikhoun, the fact that the patients were there and tissue samples were taken was critical in determining that, in fact, the agent was sarin. And that then led to the conclusion that the only possible culprit was the Syrian regime, which had the capability not only of manufacturing sarin, but of delivering it. And secondly, there were particular strains, and here we go into chemical analysis, and I am certainly not an expert on this, but it was a particular signature that that was known to exist only in the chemical arsenal of the Syrian regime, which of course was dismantled after 2013. But at the time, this was clear that it had that particular signature, and so these were remnants from things that were when the arsenal was dismantled. Clearly, not everything was destroyed.
Great, thank you. And then for Dr. Omar Dawachi, we've known since the time of Florence Nightingale all the way through really great research conducted by the International Rescue Committee in the Congo that the secondary effects of war, and in particular the breakdown in healthcare systems and the spread of disease, kill far more people than the bullets and the bombs themselves. And that's very true today in Yemen, for instance, where a cholera epidemic that almost certainly would not have occurred without the war there has killed more than 2,000 civilians already. But I wonder, in your thoughts, to what extent has infections and epidemics become not simply a secondary effect of war, but a primary effect of war, and part of the point of war, and has it been recognized as a way to inspire greater fear in people than simply bullets or bombs would? And from an ethnographic and anthropological perspective, what do you think the role is of these infections in war today?
Yes, excellent question. I think definitely the line between the direct and the indirect is getting increasingly blurred. I think many actors in these conflicts or many belligerents are increasingly taking health and producing afflictions at multiple levels as one of the tactics and strategies. The issues also of health and healthcare has always been, I think, historically we know that this is not really a new tactic. It's not really a new instrumentalization. There's a history from the use of smallpox to use of different kind of biological weapons and besiegement in general, sanctions. We know that these kind of war tactics, the line of what is really then direct and indirect is something very murky. So ethnographically, what is really fascinating for me was the fact that with the absence of very clear scientific evidence, people themselves, when you interview them, when you talk to injured populations and you talk to injured families, because many of these injuries are being affected by many people within it's a collective injury. It's like it's the father and the mother and the kids are all being affected by a blast, and the fear of what happens to this injury was one of the most fascinating kind of findings for me, or at least one of the most fascinating responses had been the sense that these war injuries are more prone to infection. They're more prone to also cancer. One of the cases that one of the patients that came to AUB and I spent time interviewing, his whole family had been bombed at one point during the Iraq War, and he later on, a few years later, was injured by a paramilitary bullet by probably Blackwater, and what was fascinating that his family insisted, although he had a wound injury, insisted that he goes and check for cancer every 6 months. Because the the sense within the community is that all these injuries have different kinds of incarnations in the future. So things like that were very, very fascinating to understand with dealing with ethnographically with people. And what is fascinating also is that all the narratives about the healthcare breakdown, the not trusting the healthcare system had to do a lot also with the spread of these infections in the hospitals. That people know that when you go to a hospital, you'll come out with another major problem. And I think these are important ethnographic notes that help us as both people who are interested in health to understand places where research is relatively difficult to do. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
All right, I'll take questions from the audience. Nina Tannenwald, thank you.
Thanks very much. This is a really interesting panel and a little very scary. But my question is for Youth Tilterman. So I liked your comparison between the two cases. They're 30 years apart, and you were focusing on some of the similarities in the political dynamics, but they are 30 years apart, and there are some important differences too, especially the adoption of the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1997. And I mean, you're sort of talking about issues of accountability, and I wonder if you would say more about how you see the broader accountability regime today for use of chemical weapons. I mean, you focused on states and the sort of pressure that the UN is under, but in the current case, the UN did finally come forward and say it was Syria. And so there's different sort of dynamics today. There's a larger accountability, right, regime system. It doesn't always work perfectly, but it is bigger than it was in 1988. And I wonder if you would say just something about sort of what do you see as the key mechanisms in that kind of accountability regime today for chemical weapons beyond simply states and the UN?
You know, norms are based on a sense of shared humanity that a particular weapon in this case is beyond the pale, and so it is not a matter of just states and UN and other institutions. They are in a way expressing what humanity feels about a particular issue, in this case chemical weapons. So first of all, we all have a responsibility to press for accountability. But I think the mechanism, and maybe it didn't come out clearly enough in my presentation, but something I want to stress now is that establishing the facts remains critically important. And it has to be done by non-partisan, impartial, neutral, whatever, actors that have the requisite expertise and that are recognized to have the requisite expertise and that are recognized to be impartial. And the problem is that now, certainly in the age of social media, which is another difference between now and 1988, because in 1988 Iranians had to fly journalists into Halabja in order to see what happened. Today it's people with cell phones photographing what happens in real time. So there's a huge difference. But in either case, you get a real confusion in the fog of war as to what really happened, and you get all kinds of non-experts weighing in and having strong opinions that carry the day in some ways, despite the fact that they have no idea what they're talking about. So establishing the facts, it remains the mechanism for accountability. And the agencies that we have are properly equipped for that. And I think when I said earlier, the culprit may not be punished, but there may be a post-conflict effort to reinstate or reaffirm the norm. It would have to be based on these independent investigations that have taken place, the cumulative impact of showing that, in fact, chemical weapons were used, the types of chemicals that were used, and who was using them under what circumstances. This information exists, it's all there. but it's become subsumed under the whole whir of claims and counterclaims by people who think they know what happened, and of course who have political agendas.
Can I follow up on that? So you seem to be saying it's a communication problem, not a power problem?
Of course, it's a power problem, but I also said that when it comes to power, when you look at the regimes, their top priority is to win, and to do it by any means possible, meaning whatever weapons and whatever propaganda serves them. That is to be expected. But when it comes to the sponsors, in this case, because we're not talking about chemical weapons used by the global powers, we're talking about chemical weapons used by regional powers or countries. When it comes to the global powers, they have conflicting interests, and they will prioritize them. So in the case of the Iran-Iraq war, the United States clearly did not want Iraq to lose against Iran. That was the top priority, even though, as they used to say, they held their noses dealing with the Iraqis, the regime, at the time, because they knew how brutal it was and what kind of weapons it was using. I mean, if you look at the CIA and DIA documents from the time, it's quite well described. So, and in the case of Syria, for the Russians, again, the reason the Russians intervened militarily in September 2015 in the first place was, of course, to preserve the regime from collapsing, to preserve the regime and prevent it from collapsing. And at the same time, the United States and Russia are states that have no interest in proliferation of weapons that eventually can come back to haunt their own soldiers in the battlefield, or their own civilians, for that matter. So they have an interest beyond the individual conflicts to stress these issues. And that is all we've got to work with, frankly, because there is no international arbiter that can reinstate a norm. It's got to be the very unsatisfactory situation of states like the United States and Russia and others, members of the Security Council, who can do so. And so we as citizenry should work through them in order to accomplish this, but using, again, the information gathered by independent agencies.
Over here?
Yes. My question is, Omar, thank you for two fantastic presentations. And I'm wondering, two questions. One, you mentioned very briefly in the beginning that you were seeing this Iraqi-Bakr appearing in Yemen and in Syria, along with Iraq, and in Afghanistan, but to a lesser extent. What might explain that? And does that say something about the particular toxicity of weapons that are used very recently? Because Syria has not, and Yemen have not gone through the 3 decades of warfare that Iraq has, or the sanctions, or any of that stuff. And a second question, somewhat connected to that, is you mentioned briefly the Syrian Civil War as the quote-unquote end of antibiotics. Can you expand a little on that? What does that mean? Where does that leave us?
So yes, this is excellent. These are excellent questions, and I apologize. I realized I had more material than 20 minutes, so I had to finish very quickly, and I was hoping that people will probe during the Q&A. So, first question. We still are not sure how, let's say, is the mechanism of the Acinetobacter evolution happening in all these places in a different way or not. We just don't know. And this is the kind of work that we are trying to investigate by taking on samples and doing clinical epidemiology work, environmental and clinical epidemiology on these wounds, and by trying to do more lab analysis also to understand if the types of this bacteria is similar, or are we facing different kind of evolution. What is fascinating about this Acinetobacter is that it's like an archive of resistance. So it actually could tell you, by understanding the genetic makeup of it, it can tell you what kind of exposure it had. So you can know that if it's been exposed to heavy metals. You know also if it's exposed to other antibiotics, or it's been it has acquired these resistance from other kind of bacteria through different modes of exchange of DNA called horizontal exchange. So we really don't know yet, but the presence of this bacteria is now in many of these conflict settings seems to be very much emerging out of the exposure of wounds, because it's around. The bacteria is around. Probably it's here too, but it begins to proliferate when it has an opportunity to do that. So basically, in hospitals where there are use of different kind of metal surfaces. For example, if you put an internal fixator in a war wound, it will actually, this could trigger also the evolution of a multi-drug resistant type. So it's not something that has emerged in one place. It is something that exists in different places, but we don't know if the process of its evolution is the same everywhere, or there are different kind of types that exist across these different places. So these are some of the questions that could help in identifying the relationship of that. So the other question about the end of antibiotics, it is the global fear right now, is that antibiotics is ending. This is the age of the end of antibiotics, and we're going back to the 19th century, pre-Second World War. I mean, the paradox here of antibiotics is that the first use of antibiotics was in the Second World War, and if the end of the antibiotics and the ongoing wars in the Middle East, it's a very interesting phenomena that the rise and fall of antibiotics really is connected with war. The problem with this global discourse is that war is not really on the main agenda. It's most of, probably rightly so in other places in the world, is that this has to do a lot with the kind of antibiotics used in farming, in meat, in what we've been giving to the animals in general, or also the other kind of reason or a driver is what they call antibiotic stewardship, is how we prescribe antibiotics and how we use it in different healthcare settings. War is completely on the role of war in pushing this kind of increasing resistance is not really on the agenda right now of the global health community. And I think what we are trying to say is that this is where you see an acceleration, not necessarily the birth of resistance, but more specifically an acceleration of the process of antibiotic resistance. So why is this interesting in general is because in terms of Geneva Conventions also, the effect, if you know that weaponry has a very direct cause, let's say pushing, that has this effect on long-term effects on health, then this could be really a very strong argument that could be used to as a mode of war deterrence. So I think there is a lot of interesting avenues, a lot of interesting possibilities to link this notion of war to the rising problem of multi-drug resistance, because I think it tells the story of war in a very fascinating way, because it really is a weapon that we've developed during war, and it seems like it's becoming obsolete also under war.
It's frightening, for sure, and global in impact. Are there any indications of other health threats of this magnitude that resulted from prior wars? Or does this have a unique element just in terms of the potential severity?
Good question. I mean, I cannot really... I think it's a very peculiar problem right now. The problem of it is that the threat here is that we are going to be dealing with something that is not going to work anymore. You know, the fix to it is developing new drugs, which the pharmaceutical companies are not necessarily ready to do that because most of the investments are in chronic diseases or in psychotropic diseases. These are things that people would take for the rest of their lives. So investing in like these short-term newer antibiotics is not necessarily on the agenda, and I think that's why there has been a global push to put this as a priority issue in terms of global health. This is one point. The second point is that this is going to be, I mean, most of the work in hospitals is defined by the use of antibiotics. And not only that, is that the spread of multi-drug resistance is basically, these are things that will stay within the hospital. It's not an easy thing to clean the hospital after it gets infected with, after antibiotic resistance become endemic in these spaces, because you have to burn the place down. Because these bacteria also become resistant to the cleaning chemicals that are used to kill it. They develop resistance to that. So indeed, I don't think there has been a health problem of this magnitude in general. I think maybe, and it's the fourth medical condition, if I'm not mistaken, that to be brought into the UN General Assembly after Ebola, AIDS, and something, the fourth. No, I don't think it got the same. Maybe something maybe old. I think smallpox or one of the older problems. But it is to go back to your question, to answer it in a more with ambivalence, is to say I don't think there has been a condition like that, because it threatens our ability to do even medicine, to respond to the problem. I mean, it's really, it disarms us from something that we have taken for granted.
So I think we have time for a couple more questions. Maybe we'll take them all together now and then have them answered at the end. So 1, 2, and then 3. Sure.
Thank you so much. Such interesting presentations. And a really kind of grim outlook in so many ways. That's always something that's to be found. But I have 2 questions. One is for Juice. I think it's a really interesting presentation, but what about regional actors and dynamics that are in so many ways fueling these wars? So Saudi Arabia was appointed to the UN Human Rights Council by Great Britain, and is now actually blockading all possibility of any UN intervention in Yemen, which is causing this massive cholera outbreak, causing famine, massive devastation. And so there's a regional element to the Syrian Civil War that I didn't really hear much about, which would be interesting for you to, if it's possible, to elaborate on in terms of at least the role of Gulf states and Turkey, of kind of 6+1, if we can call it that. And my question for Omar, I'm also from Iraq, so it's really interesting to hear this perspective that I think we've kind of shared experiences with. But are there any other regional comparative cases where chemicals were used during war, where we also saw this kind of outbreak of antibiotic resistance that the Middle East can be situated alongside?
Back.
I guess it's a continuation on this gentleman's question regarding war and antibiotic resistance. Is it true? I got this from my peers that they had the same issue in Vietnam, but it wasn't talked about. However, when I talk to a few vets, when they go to the vet, the issue is that whatever is plaguing them, antibiotics is not working. So I just wanted to know, is there any precedent or connection?
Last question over here.
I guess I also wanted to build on the question, the connection between the war and the development of multi-resistant strains of bacteria. And in some ways, I'm wondering if that reference to like the ISIS of bacteria is actually, maybe you can think of it a little bit more than metaphor, in the sense of there seems to be not just connection of war, but like the disintegration of sovereignty related to the diseffectiveness or ineffectiveness of antibiotics in the sense in which like new forms of sovereignties or political affiliations or associations are forming in these absences. And if actually we can sort of draw like a more than just a metaphor, but like an analytic based on those comparisons on parallel levels.
We'll start with Houston and then finish up with Omar.
So thank you for your question. It's chemical warfare was what I was talking about, my hobby, but now you're asking me a question really about my job, which is to work on conflict in the Middle East. The conflicts in the Middle East today, we can look at the local level, the regional level, and the global level. And there are actors involved in conflicts in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and Libya, elsewhere, that are of all these levels. And they interact, and it makes the conflict so much more difficult to resolve. So quite apart from the chemical weapons used in Syria, the Syrian War, of course, started small, as most conflicts do. In this case, through a popular uprising that was then militarized because of the interaction between protesters and the regime, and the intervention of regional states in terms of supplying weapons, and then from the Syrian regime side, also getting the help of Iran and Hezbollah, and later Russia. So then the global actors become involved. The United States became involved because of the threat posed by the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. And so what started out as a popular protest against oppressive rule becomes a proxy conflict for regional actors that see a vacuum and see their own strategic interests threatened in Syria. And my sense is that if you look at this as concentric circles, the only way to start solving the problem is you need to have the global actors to come to some kind of common understanding or common vision as to how the conflict can be ended, even if that doesn't end the conflict, but that would create a space for the regional actors to de-escalate and to also come to some kind of understanding. And that eventually you come to the local level and you have to resolve the problems that started the conflict in the first place. And so what we see is that Russia and the United States are more or less on the same page now in Syria, because the Trump administration, in some ways consistent with the later years of the Obama administration, is no longer intent on removing the regime. And that puts it on the same page with the Russians, who, of course, are trying to protect the regime. And that can then lead to a way to get to focus on the regional actors, because we see Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Israel, all taking an active role in the outcome of the conflict in Syria and trying to protect their strategic interests. And to find an accommodation there is now the critical role that maybe the United States and Russia can start to play. But I wouldn't be too optimistic. I think it's going to take a long time to resolve this conflict. In Syria, you're absolutely right about Saudi Arabia by imposing a siege. This is very much what Omar was talking about as well. That is a weapon. And it's the weaponization of hunger, basically, encouraging, even though not explicitly, but encouraging de facto the spread of cholera in Yemen. It's a huge catastrophe in Yemen at the moment, and unfortunately, it's not discussed too much publicly. When Saudi Arabia joins the Human Rights Council, money talks. In some cases, and unfortunately it can lead to some very unfortunate results, such as in this case.
Finish this off briefly.
Yes, Allah bil khair. So the question is, so I'm not trying to link chemical weapons to the rise of antimicrobial resistance, so I want to make that clear. I think the theory right now, the hypothesis that is plausible hypothesis, is that the presence of heavy metals in weaponry in general has been one of the main drivers of the increase in multi-drug resistance. So we are seeing this also in places that have been isolated, like Gaza, for example. Like there is the Acinetobacter baumannii is being reported in Gaza. And this is all had to do also with and we know from recent research that heavy metals have been detected on the hair samples of women and children who are being affected by the Israeli bombings. So we know that there's heavy metal, be it in the environment or be it on the bodies of people. There's something fishy there. There's a smoking gun, I guess. So how is that related? We still don't know. And I think what we were trying to do, we are hoping to do in this project, is to take these different sites in Gaza, in Yemen, in Syria and Iraq, and explore, and actually even in Jordan with all these MSF hospital, ICRC, we are partnering with MSF and ICRC to develop this project to really try to get the sampling and develop a systematic way to explore these questions. So yes, it's been happening in other places, but what is really kind of the smoking gun here is what we think is heavy metals. The Vietnam story is fascinating because there has been reports of this bacteria in Vietnam, but not necessarily as in this kind of epidemic level that we see in the present day. So this makes sense because historically this antibiotic resistance has been evolving through our use of antibiotics and its effects on resistance over the years. So I think that would be really a fascinating question to explore. Were there any really reports on this? Were there these were other kind of medical conditions, maybe Pseudomonas, other bacteria? So I think this is something that definitely will need to be understood historically. And I think our historian of science, Hannah Landecker, who is really written a lot of interesting, she's writing currently a book on the history of antimicrobial resistance. She's based in UCLA, is on that question, and it would be fascinating to know what she comes up with. So you picked up on what I kind of alluded to in the beginning. So this idea of ungovernability, this kind of ungovernable bacteria, ungovernable states. And in a way, yes, I'm not even saying that it's a metaphor. I'm actually kind of, in a more linguistic way, I'm saying this is a metonym. It's metonymic of the breakdown of healthcare and of the states, and definitely could be seen as a partly a mirror and a manifestation of the breakdown of governance, of biopolitical order, of states, of what you call sovereignty. So this is kind of has been my work, is to think about this constant breakdown of power as something that is inherent in power as such, but also as something that in recent years, especially with the proliferations of war in the Middle East, has become a condition, has become this decay of modern states is now where these wars are happening, is something that we need to be understood through a different kinds of scales. No, it's not just about identity politics or ideologies or beliefs, but there's something ecological, it's an ecological scale in terms of these conflicts that needs to be understood at much broader level, because it changes the future, changes survival, changes a lot of aspects of how we can imagine life and how we can imagine the futures in this part of the world.
Well, I'll close now by saying I'd like to thank our panelists here on our panel Investigating Ground Zero, and all of you for your excellent questions. We'll have a 15-minute coffee break now, and then come back for the next excellent panel on illicit trade of deadly bombs right here at 11:35. Thank you all.
Just one. Okay.
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Until green light and
Cool.
turn off.
I was a mic runner intern this summer, so I got that like technique down. I was a programs intern at the Middle East Institute, and we put on a lot of like events, and so the interns get to run the mics.
Nice.
So I'm good with the whole
How was
like.
that internship?
You guys can be heard inside.
Oh, are they on right
Yeah,
now?
this is on.
Anyway.
So like 105. 105, we should have 105.
I have one, but.
105 it is.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and start on our second panel, which is entitled Illicit Trade of Deadly Bombs. You guys have your, okay. So we're very lucky to have as our moderator Nina Tannenwald, who's a faculty fellow at the Watson Institute and a director of International Relations Program. She's also a senior lecturer in the Department of Political Science. She was previously assistant professor at the University of Colorado Boulder, and assistant and then associate research professor at the Watson Institute. She's been a visiting professor of Cornell and Stanford Universities, a Carnegie Scholar, and a MacArthur Foundation Research and Writing Fellow in International Peace and Security. She's served as the Franklin Fellow in the Bureau of International Security in 2012 and 13, and Nonproliferation in the U.S. State Department. Professor Tannenwald was the director of the International Relations Program at the Institute from 2003 until 2006, and prior to coming to Brown, she's held fellowships at Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation and Harvard's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. So thank you so much to Professor Tannenwald for moderating this panel.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be here today and to have been invited to join this discussion. And so I would like to introduce our panelists for today. Our topic is the illicit trade of deadly bombs. And I will introduce them both first, and then we'll have them speak. So Hugh Gusterson on the end is a professor of anthropology and international affairs at George Washington University. And he's an very, very well-known anthropologist of the nuclear weapons establishment. He's written 3 books, one called Nuclear Rights, one called People of the Bomb, and one called Drone, which I presume is on drones and not nuclear weapons. He is editor of several other books and numerous articles. He is a regular columnist for the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. And he's also served on the executive board of the American Anthropological Association. And he is now president of the American Ethnological Society, and he was a member of the American Anthropological Association's task force on engagement with Israel-Palestine. The title of his talk today is The Proliferation Debate in Cross-Cultural Perspective. Let me introduce then William Hartung, who is a longtime, well-known, and leading expert on the global arms industry and arms trade. He is also the author of numerous books. One, Prophets of War, Lockheed Martin and the Making of the Military-Industrial Complex, and co-editor of Lessons from Iraq, Avoiding the Next War, and a book called And Weapons for All, a critique of U.S. arms sales policies from Nixon through the Clinton administrations. He has, from 2007 to 2011, he was the director of the Arms and Security Initiative at the New American Foundation, and prior to that, he worked as director of the Arms Trade Resource Center at the World Policy Institute. He also has numerous articles and op-eds in prominent national publications and is featured widely as a talking head, as an expert on TV and other media. And he blogs for the Huffington Post and Medium. And he will talk today about tracking the Mideast arms trade, available resources and research challenges. So let me turn to Hugh first. Would you like to begin?
Yeah.
And we'll give our panelists about 20 minutes or so each.
Just use the down arrow. Yes. Or the,
This should also,
Yeah.
you want to put it,
yeah, we'll put it up on the screen.
slideshow,
Oh, yeah.
and then from beginning.
All right, you can just open it.
Okay. Thanks for bearing with us there. So I think I was invited to give a somewhat broader perspective, bringing nuclear weapons and the wider debate on non-proliferation of nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons onto the agenda. I'm interested in the question of how weapons become illicit. Is it a particular weapon that becomes illicit? Is it a particular weapon in the hands of particular people that becomes illicit? And I want to persuade you that in the case of nuclear weapons, it seems to be the owners of the weapons that are illicit, in some cases more than the weapons themselves, which is a distinction we could make with chemical and biological weapons. I just came from a conference on militarism at Michigan yesterday, and one of the speakers there, the anthropologist Anna Waxelbrum, gave a genealogical account of the development of disarmament and non-proliferation discourse from 1945 to the present day, and made what I thought was a very trenchant observation, which is that up until the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, the discourse was really focused on the international control of nuclear weapons, the possibility of nuclear disarmament. And since the Non-Proliferation Treaty of 1968, non-proliferation discourse has sort of edged out disarmament from center stage, so that the global project in regard to nuclear weapons, but also biological and chemical weapons, has become one of non-proliferation more than one of disarmament. And I want you to bear that in mind as I go through these comments today. So I'm interested in non-proliferation as a global project to ask, whose project is it? Who does it benefit? Who does it keep down? How might it be seen differently as a project from different vantage points in different parts of the world? So recently, for a talk I was giving at Georgetown, I was looking for a slide on Google that would help me summarize the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and I found this one immediately popped up. It's one of the first things that came up at the top of the Google search. And it summarizes the set of bargains that are at stake in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I don't know who Jeffrey Taliaferro is, but he's very high up in this Google search. And I found this summary of the Non-Proliferation Treaty quite fascinating. It says that it recognizes two categories of signatories. On the one hand, the nuclear weapon states, that's the United States, Russia, China, France, and Britain, and non-nuclear weapon states. And the basic premise of the NPT, it says, is that the nuclear weapon states should not transfer nuclear weapons to the non-nuclear weapon states, and the non-nuclear weapon states agree that they won't try and get those materials, and they agree to be policed by the International Atomic Energy Agency to make sure that if they have nuclear reactors, they're not secretly trying to stockpile enriched uranium and plutonium. And the nuclear weapon states agree to transfer peaceful nuclear technology for nuclear energy, right? So that's his summary of the deal. Now, I don't know how many of you know the text of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but for people in much of the developing world, it kind of skips an important article, Article 6. You find no mention in his summary of a commitment that the so-called nuclear weapon states made. Each of the parties to the treaty undertakes to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date. This was signed in 1968, and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. So if you go back to that slide, there should be something down here somewhere that says that the nuclear weapon states agree to make speedy progress on giving up their nuclear weapons, but somehow there's an empty space in the bottom left there. If you look at the stockpiles of the nuclear powers after they signed it, 1968 is, down here. So they agreed to cessation of the arms race at an early date by doubling their stockpiles, right? Now, they have brought the stockpiles down considerably since the end of the Cold War. I'm not an international lawyer, but that doesn't look to me like obvious compliance with Article 6. And if you look at nuclear testing, in 1968 is here. They agreed to cessation of the arms race, but actually they keep on testing nuclear weapons until the mid-1990s. Right? So the non-proliferation regime from the metropolis looks as if it's instantiated this permanent distinction between countries authorized to have these weapons and countries not authorized to have them. From the other vantage point, the nuclear states have broken their part of the bargain, which was to stop the arms race and disarm. Okay, so to take a little look at the way it looks from the metropolis, there's this constant trickle of books about the dangers of nuclear proliferation. I just plucked some of them sort of at random from a Google search, but it's like an industry of books warning us about the dangers of Islamic countries in particular, and these days it's North Korea, acquiring nuclear weapons. And this fear of developing countries acquiring nuclear weapons is anchored by an ideology that, drawing on Edward Said's work, I refer to as nuclear Orientalism. And there's a cite to an article of mine from Cultural Anthropology where I lay out the basic tenets of nuclear Orientalism. This is an ideology that's common among liberals as well as conservatives. It's not a left-right divided kind of ideology. You find it among many liberal arms control analysts as well as conservatives. The tenets are that developing countries lack the technical rationality to manage nuclear weapons safely. Developing countries lack the democratic self-control that's required of a nuclear power. Developing countries don't seek nuclear weapons for serious security interests. They seek them out of vanity or to gain attention, and I'm going to give you some examples, some of these in a minute. That fanatics are more likely to control nuclear weapons in developing countries. For Iran, this is a particularly strong theme, that the Iranian state would love nothing more than to commit mass suicide, and that's sort of why they want nuclear weapons. And in media coverage of developing countries trying to acquire nuclear weapons, I note that they're often likened to children or to criminals. So here are a few examples, sort of picked at random, some old, some new. The Lawrence Livermore Lab, where I did my original fieldwork studying nuclear weapons scientists, has a pamphlet that says smaller nations with deep-seated grievances against each other may lack the restraint that was exercised by the US and the USSR. By the way, that's what restraint looked like. And the Cuban Missile Crisis, I guess they didn't use the weapons in the end, but not enormously restrained. Kenneth Edelman was senior arms control official in the Reagan administration, still gives lots of talks at the Heritage Foundation. I saw him there recently. The real danger comes from some miserable third world country which decides to use these weapons either out of desperation or incivility. You know, in other words, Western countries are completely rational and self-controlled. Incivility is an interesting word to use about using nuclear weapons. Then the theme of democracy. This is a recent article from Forbes magazine. Nuclear weapons are one of those sovereign rights that should not be granted to autocratic leaders. Interesting quote for the era of Trump. Because of this adherence to core values, global public opinion trusts Western democracies to have nuclear weapons. Global public opinion trusts that, and to use them in a defensive manner. North Korea's sovereignty adheres in just one man. Now, I find this quote very interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that the US has had an intermittent debate on whether it should have a policy of no first use of nuclear weapons. That would be using nuclear weapons in a defensive manner. And the US has persistently refused to adopt a no first use policy. Reportedly, President Obama wanted to put into the last nuclear posture review the sentence that the only purpose of nuclear weapons is to deter the use of other nuclear weapons. And he was overruled by his cabinet, the Defense Secretary, the National Security Advisor, Ernie Moniz, the Secretary of Energy, and eventually backed down. And so it remains official US nuclear policy that we can threaten to use nuclear weapons and use them first. And as I heard at a conference on no first use at Harvard last Saturday, the protocol for use of nuclear weapons is that the president can use them on his sole authority. He doesn't have to consult with Congress. In practice, would presumably consult with the cabinet. So this idea that sovereignty adheres in just one man in North Korea, in the case of the use of nuclear weapons, the same is true by law, by established protocol in the United States. Bill Potter is a liberal arms control analyst at the Monterey Institute, wrote, adverse domestic opinion may also serve as a constraint on the acquisition of nuclear weapons by some nations. Japan, West Germany, Sweden, and Canada are examples of democracies where public opposition could have a decided effect on nuclear weapons decisions. The fear of adverse public opinion, on the other hand, might be expected to be marginal for many developing nations without a strong democratic tradition. Now, this again I find very interesting because Britain, France, and the United States all decided to acquire nuclear weapons in the first place with no democratic debate. The decision was made in secret. In the US case, it was withheld even from the vice president. It wasn't authorized by Congress. Most of the cabinet didn't know about it. Similar stories in Britain and in France, where Parliament was not consulted. Some reactions to India's nuclear tests. Michael Crepon is a liberal arms control analyst at the Stimson Center. When India tested its nuclear weapons in 1998, he said those tests weren't done for security purposes, despite the fact that India shared a border with China, which had nuclear weapons and with which it had fought a war. Those tests were done for reasons of domestic politics and national pride. We have street demonstrations to protest nuclear weapons. They have them to celebrate them. And moving on to North Korea, the New York Times said, maybe North Korea is just jealous of all the attention Iran has been getting as a result of Tehran's recent nuclear bad behavior and craves a spotlight of its own. You know, this is the infantilizing discourse. So many countries would love the attention Iran got from the US sanctions and so on. And Robert Einhorn, who was senior State Department official under Bill Clinton, whenever the North Koreans act up, one has to assume in part, at least, that they are trying to get the world's attention. Well, I'll get to this in a minute. So here are some cartoons that make some of these points. The cartoon on the Islamic bomb emphasizing the fanaticism of Muslims trying to seek nuclear weapons. Some cartoons that portray Kim Jong-un as child or as a baby. Make America pay attention to me again. Some more cartoons that portray him as a small child and a baby. It's a common sort of trope among American cartoonists. Of course, there is another way of looking at North Korea's desire to acquire nuclear weapons. In 1994, the Clinton administration came within a hair's breadth of going to war with North Korea. There were protracted discussions in the cabinet of a bombing campaign to bomb nuclear sites in North Korea. Eventually, instead of doing that, the US negotiated an agreed framework. And part of the agreed framework is that North Korea agreed to destroy a nuclear reactor it had, and that reactor was destroyed. And they agreed not to seek to acquire nuclear weapons. In exchange for that, the US and some allies agreed to build a more proliferation-resistant light water reactor, and they agreed to make fuel supplies available to North Korea. After the Republicans took control of the House of Representatives in 1994, Congress started to defund the US side of the bargain. The fuel shipments arrived, but they were always late, and that reactor that was promised was never built, right? And so if you were to look at this from the vantage point of North Korea, it looks as if the US reneged on the deal, not just North Korea. You have to remember also that the US and North Korea are still formally at war. The US maintains thousands of troops just across the border from North Korea, and until recently it had a stockpile of tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, but those were withdrawn a few years ago. President George W. Bush declared North Korea part of an axis of evil with Iraq, and we all saw what happened with Iraq. And there were persistent CIA forecasts through the 1990s, publicly broadcast forecasts, that the North Korean regime was going to fall, that it was so fragile that it would fall at any moment. So if you look at this from the vantage point of North Korea's rulers, it looks as if the United States wants regime change, not an agreement it will abide by with the North Koreans. And you can imagine why they might want to withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty and acquire their own nuclear weapons. So the silver lining in the cloud of Donald Trump is that this Orientalist discourse on nuclear weapons is beginning to look a little more fragile than it did under Obama or even under George W. Bush. I've noticed with my students at George Washington University, many of whom are planning to work for the CIA, the Defense Department, the State Department, I've had them read my article on Orientalism in the past, and they just dismiss it. They say, you know, we're not even going to debate it. Everyone knows that nuclear weapons are safer in Americans' hands. You know, you can come up with these fancy, abstruse academic arguments, but we know they're safer in American hands. Since the election of Donald Trump, I've noticed a shift in their tone. I've noticed students asking me, can he really launch the weapons on his own? Surely there has to be some way of restraining him. You mean really the War Powers Act doesn't apply to killing 50 million people in an afternoon with nuclear weapons, right? So this discourse is being a little destabilized. It's looking a little bit more gray, and you have this merging of Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And more attention to the question of whether it's the people with the enormous stockpile or the person with 15 or 20 weapons who's the threat. Okay, so this conference is mainly focused on chemical and biological weapons. So let me, in closing, say a little bit about the issue of chemical and biological weapons. There's been a discourse across the years of chemical weapons being the poor man's nuclear weapon and biological weapons being the poor man's nuclear weapon, right? We can ask some questions about this. I mean, when chemical and biological weapons have been used in practice, the numbers of people they've killed have been very, very small. And my wife, Alison McFarlane, has actually written a very interesting article trying to interrogate the very category of weapons of mass destruction and argue that there is really only one weapon of mass destruction, and that is the nuclear bomb. That as terrible as chemical and biological weapons are, they don't fall in the same kind of category, the same family with nuclear weapons. But anyway, chemical and biological weapons have been referred to in the West as the poor man's nuclear weapons. So what are the implications of what I've been saying for chemical and biological weapons? For some people, the fact that Iraq and Syria, two Islamic regimes, have used chemical weapons prove the Orientalist hypothesis. I once presented an early version of my paper on Orientalism, and the discussant was the distinguished Sir Lawrence Friedman, one of the greatest historians of nuclear strategy in the world. There were 3 or 4 people on the panel, and he gave most of his discussant remarks to the other papers, and then at the end he turned to me and he said, as for your paper, I have only one thing to say to you. The buggers used nuclear weapons in Iraq, used chemical weapons in Iraq. And for him, that was all he had to say, right? The whole paper was written off by the fact that an Islamic regime had used chemical weapons, right? And it showed that such countries couldn't be trusted with weapons of mass destruction. So that's one way of taking this discussion. I want to observe that we have a biological weapons convention since 1972, banning biological weapons, a chemical weapons convention since 1993. Both of these conventions were focused on destroying very large stockpiles that the Americans and the Russians had accumulated, but they also had the purpose of making sure that non-nuclear countries would not be able to acquire these sort of low-level WMD equivalents. And so I would argue we have, if you look at weapons of mass destruction as a family of 3, we have treaties that ban 2 members of the family of 3, the 2 members that might threaten American and Russian troops on the battlefield. We do not have a convention that has gone into effect that bans the really serious weapon of mass destruction, nuclear weapons. Though that may be beginning to change. So in July of 2017, the United Nations voted to approve a ban on nuclear weapons in the tradition of the cluster munitions ban, the landmine ban treaty, and so on. I noticed that I was curious to see how this would be reported. I picked up my local newspaper, the Washington Post, which, you know, is a fairly serious newspaper, and I was curious to see how they would report this the next day. They did have a 1-paragraph story on it on page 18, that the United Nations, 122 countries, had voted to ban nuclear weapons. I guess it's not really that big a story, right? This is my last slide. This gives you the statistics on the vote. 122 countries voted to ban nuclear weapons in the UN General Assembly. All of the official nuclear states boycotted the negotiations. They refused to participate in any way, refused to recognize the legitimacy of more than half the countries in the world negotiating a ban of the most dangerous weapon in the world. One country voted against. I bet you don't know which one it was, or maybe Bill does. It was the Netherlands, interestingly enough. Singapore abstained, and then 69 nations didn't vote. So at the moment, 53 countries have signed it, 3 countries have ratified it, and if it gets to the point where 50 countries ratify it, the treaty enters into force, though it's not quite clear what it means for a treaty to enter into force when the only countries that have the weapon in question refuse to recognize the legitimacy of the process that led to the treaty. So if we ever get to that point, it will be very interesting. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugh. Bill?
Oh, do you have a slide? Show? No.
No, I don't. I make hand gestures. Just to mix it up. So I was curious at first why I was invited, since I know nothing about chemical weapons, but now I do, so I should be welcome. I've been tracking the arms trade since I was in college. I was active in the anti-apartheid movement, and I wrote for a small magazine called Southern Africa, which was a collective that supported the liberation movements in Southern Africa. So my beat was who's violating the arms embargo, and more general, the role of corporate investment in South Africa in enabling their arms industry. But it's been sort of episodic. There's not a lot of funding to work on this issue. There was kind of a surge after the '91 Gulf War, because suddenly everybody was concerned about how Saddam Hussein got his weapons. And of course, he was aided by almost every major power in the world, including the United States. And my first book was being shopped at that time. And after the bombing started against Iraq, the next day I got a call from my agent saying, "We sold the book." The guy said he looked at your proposal and he said, "This seems strangely relevant. Did he change it or something?" So crises seem to drive interest in funding in this issue, which is a mixed blessing. More recently, I've been writing mostly about U.S. arms to the Gulf and their role in the war in Yemen, both the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So in terms of illicit arms trading, it's not so much secretive arms dealers and that kind of thing. It's more weapons that are traded through normal channels, which are being used in arguably illegal ways. And this is not a Trumpian phenomenon by any means. Under President Obama, the U.S. entered into offers to sell $115 billion to Saudi Arabia, which was the most of any administration ever. Of course, Donald Trump went to Saudi Arabia and said, "Well, I'll give him $110 billion all at once." And he was lying, because he had no idea what he was going to sell them. Many of the deals had been made under Obama, but nonetheless, he's keen to sell them, and he's in their corner 100%, which has many problems, especially in the current moment. And then the UAE, which has gotten less attention, although it plays, in my mind, an equally damaging role in Yemen and in the region, received about $30 billion in U.S. weapons, but some of them included things like 30,000 bombs, attack helicopters, equipment that they're using in Yemen. Also, a lot of training from U.S. troops and a kind of special relationship between U.S. and UAE special forces. So that's why I'm looking at this, not just as an abstract exercise in how can you figure out the puzzle of the weapons trade. But then in order to speak on it, you do need to try to track the trade. And the United States actually has more documentation of its arms trade than almost any other nation. But they leave out the most important parts. So for example, a major arms deal has to be reported to Congress. And there's a letter from the Pentagon that says, it's to this country, it's worth this much. It gives explicit detail about each weapon that's part of the package. It tells you which contractors are building it where. Are U.S. personnel going to be sent in support of the deal? And then Congress, in theory, could vote that down, although they've never done it, because under a court decision that goes way back, they would need a 2/3 majority of both houses of Congress to do that. But sometimes Congress will make a fuss, and they'll make an issue, and things will be delayed, postponed, taken off the table. So there's informal ways to block these things, or explicit legislation against selling to a particular country. So there's that. And then you can also get information from the Congressional Research Service, the Government Accountability Office, the State Department tracks commercial deals, which they license, which tend to be more in the nature of small arms. The Commerce Department does some reporting on dual-use items that they sell. But a lot of these are not as explicit as the Pentagon notices. So, for example, the State Department Section 655 report that they're required to give every year tracks categories. You know, it's bombs, it's military electronics, it's firearms of some sort. So it's not the same level of detail. Sometimes the GAO will dig into a particular case, like they did one recently on, you know, is Egypt keeping close enough track of the U.S. weapons that are being supplied to it? Or some of them seem to be leaking out to terrorist groups through corruption or incompetence or otherwise. And then the Congressional Research Service just gives you numbers. So who are the biggest suppliers to the developing world, and what's their share of the market? So they do that pretty much every year. And this becomes part of the problem, is after that initial detailed description, all you get are dollar numbers. You know, so the Pentagon reports, you know, we sold, you know, $5 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia last year. But it won't tell, and we delivered, you know, $1 billion or whatever it was. But they won't tell you what was delivered. So you have to dig that up in some other way. And when I was doing the work on Saudi Arabia, you know, I asked the Pentagon's Defense Security Cooperation Agency, which only the Pentagon could call it that, because it's basically their arms brokerage. But anyway, their position is, we don't reveal that. You can ask Saudi Arabia. And for some reason, they were not interested in telling me. So there's that problem. There's also a lot of these deals are quite large, as I indicated, and they take a long time to come to fruition. So of the $115 billion under Obama that was offered, only about half of that resulted in formal agreements where they signed on the dotted line and said, we're really going to do this. And only about $20 billion were delivered during his term. So there's $95 billion worth of weapons that were offered to Saudi Arabia that are somewhere in the ether. In some cases, it's just the length of time. They offer them F-15s, combat aircraft, in 2010, and the first ones were delivered in December 2016. So some of it is production, it's paperwork, it's, you know, jockeying over the price and so forth. Some of it is a country decides later down the road, well, actually, we can't afford this stuff, and so the deal just falls apart. And I think the tracking also has some issues. There may be things moving that just aren't reflected in official documents. So if you want to know kind of the most important aspect of it, which is what weapons are actually there and how are they being used, you have to turn to other sources than the U.S. government, except for the occasional congressional investigation. And so, you know, there are some media outlets that do decent reporting, Defense News, Defense One, which is actually funded by Northrop Grumman, actually does some good reporting. Jane's Publications, Reuters has done some good work. I have a colleague, Andrew Feinstein, who did a book called Shadow Wars, who does a lot about the other kind of illicit trade, the brokers, the dealers, the secretive channels, and so forth. So there's that source. Then there's NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty, which actually send people in the field, and they found fragments of U.S. supplied cluster bombs and guided bombs near sites in Yemen where civilians have been killed. So that may be actually the best source, is people going in on the ground. Then there's things like the Stockholm Peace Research Institute, which has a database. They just use public sources from all over the world. And if you look at it, it is quite detailed as to the type of equipment. But they have this parenthesis rule. If it's in a parenthesis, they're not really sure. And so when I went through the list of deliveries to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, a lot of parentheses there, a lot of uncertainty. And also, in general, they don't deal with small arms and light weapons. Then there's the Norwegian Initiative on Small Arms Transfers, which does have a database on small arms, mostly by type, not always by actual designation. But when I went to their website in preparation for this talk, it said we will not be updated beyond October 2017 due to lack of funding. So that track is going to be less helpful. There's the Small Arms Survey in Geneva, which does an annual report based on UN Comtrade data, which is taken from customs information and then voluntarily provided to the UN. But again, it's a numbers game. How big is the small arms trade? Who sells the most in dollar terms? Not so much what are the weapons, where they ended up, what are the weapons actually being used for. Probably the best source, in addition to human rights organizations, are concerted special investigations. So, for example, the Balkan Investigative Reporting Network recently did a study with about a dozen reporters on the case, looking at Freedom of Information Act requests, government documents, shipping documents, sources on the ground, determined that the Pentagon had bought about $2 billion worth of Soviet-style weaponry to provide to its allies in the Syrian war. This was not known or discussed prior to their research. Action against armed violence out of the UK FOIA'd and looked through and combed through every Pentagon document imaginable and found that since the start of the Iraq and Afghan wars, the Pentagon had bought $40 billion worth of small arms, ammunition, and attachments for small arms just to be supplied to the theaters of war in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that their most prominent tracking mechanism only accounted for about 3% of those. So there's a lot of sloppy record keeping, or at least lack of transparency about what happens with those weapons. So the closer you get to the conflict, the worse the record keeping and the less transparency. I don't know if I'm going to use my 20 minutes, but it's going to be good because we can talk more. So there's the question of what to do about it. And obviously we do need more transparency, and we need to press for it in whatever way possible. So one thing that Small Arms Survey does that's sort of towards that end is they have a transparency barometer. They rate countries about how transparent they are about their arms transfers based on their reports to the UN Arms Register or to EU bodies or their own national documents. And so that's at least a force of pressure. And groups like Transparency International do similarly. In the U.S., there's a fight now to try to keep them from rolling back transparency even further. The State Department maintains a munitions list, which is supposed to be all weapons, anything designated a weapon or weapon component, and therefore needing a license from the State Department to be transferred. And this brings it into a whole body of law and regulation about not arming human rights abusers and not fueling regional conflicts and certain tracking mechanisms to try to block corruption. And it's probably not surprising for me to say a lot of these are not fully implemented. But at least they exist, and it's a hook to try to block certain kinds of sales. So under President Obama, they had this thing called the Export Control Reform Initiative, which they were very proud of, unlike a lot of us. And basically, they took large numbers, thousands of items, off the State Department's munitions list and put them under the governance of the Commerce Department. And the Commerce Department, of course, is about promoting sales. It's not about restricting sales. And a lot of the prohibitions and the record keeping and so forth that would happen if they're on the munitions list do not happen now. And so the only category that was not dealt with under Obama was small arms, firearms. And they were planning to do it right at the time of the mass shootings in Connecticut of the school children. And they decided it would be bad optics to be opening the gates to sell small weapons worldwide in the wake of that shooting. Trump has no such concerns. And so they're moving ahead with this probably in the next few months. There is opposition in Congress, some of it jurisdictional. Senator Cardin, who's high-ranking on Senate Foreign Relations, is concerned because if these things move off the munitions list, they're technically not in his purview because they don't relate to the State Department anymore. And so he's put on some pressure from that point of view. And there's been some critiques in the media, at least more critiques than usually are given to this kind of detailed level of arms trading. So there's that fight going on. We have a project at my institute, the Center for National Policy, called the Security Assistance Monitor. And what they're doing is they're tracking all Pentagon police and military aid programs, both training and weapons. And until recently, there was no real way to figure that out. Since 9/11, there's been this whole proliferation of arms and training programs in the Pentagon, as opposed to they used to be initiated in the State Department and implemented by the Pentagon, and also were budgeted in the State Department budget. So now there's all these programs squirreled away in the Pentagon budget. There's no regular reporting on them. They had been used often to do end runs around various kinds of arms bans because they said, well, that has to do with State Department programs, where this is something different. So by painstakingly digging up government documents and doing Freedom of Information Act requests and so forth, the Security Assistance Monitor has a much better sense of what's happening in that whole other world of arms trading and military training. And there's a bill kind of working its way through that would force them to do regular reporting on this. Beginning of the year, who are we selling these things to? How big are these programs? What's the purpose? How much money is involved, and so forth. And so that may or may not make it through. So I think those are probably the main things I would have to say about the subject. And as you can see, it's some aspects of it are not nearly as complicated or don't need the same kind of expertise as tracking chemical weapons. But there still are these obstacles to finding out the key details that you really need to know in terms of impact of these sales. And then the final thing, I guess, is sort of how the suppliers kind of try to ignore the consequences of their actions. So, for example, the United States government has been continuing to supply Saudi Arabia with guided bombs and other munitions, refueling their aircraft, being used for indiscriminate bombings of civilians in Yemen. And their argument, which should be laughable but is often accepted in the press, is, well, it's because they need to be trained about how to be more accurate. That's really the problem here. And they had a $750 million program to do just that. And of course, they still were bombing funerals and civilian neighborhoods. And because in my opinion, they're not trying to miss the civilians. I think it's a version of collective punishment where they're trying to cow people into surrendering, basically. And in the UK, there was a court case saying that their support of the Saudis violated their national policy, EU policy, and their adherence to the Arms Trade Treaty. And so the court ruled that kind of in this bizarre decision, because part of the argument is if you have reason to believe that these weapons are going to be used for human rights abuses or war crimes, you shouldn't sell them. And certainly given the Saudis' record, that should have been an easy case to make. But what happened was the court said, well, they seem to be making efforts to improve their performance. And so we can't really rule that any future sale is illegal. It's kind of an open question, and we're just going to leave things as they are. Anyway, that's my short version of it. I think there's things I've missed. There's people doing very good work that I probably haven't mentioned. But I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you very much, both of you, for very interesting presentations. Let me start with a question for each of you. I'll start with Hugh. So I think your argument about nuclear Orientalism is very interesting. And I'd like to ask sort of how extensive this discourse is. So the title of your talk was The Proliferation Debate in Cross-Cultural Perspective, and you kind of presented this discourse, which is, it appears to be a discourse from the West. And I was sort of expecting you were going to present also a discourse from the other side or some other side. And so what is the sort of the counter discourse is one question. And second is, what about a country like India, who seems to have benefited from this Orientalist discourse, where India justifies its nuclear arsenal on the grounds that it's a responsible, right, responsible nuclear power, as does Israel. And so, you know, are they, you know, they're using this discourse too for their own advantage, and when you look at the nuclear doctrines of these countries, they're justifying their nuclear doctrines and their strategies in the same way that the United States does. So, for example, you have India now moving more toward a kind of counterforce nuclear doctrine, borrowing, right, following in the sort of the U.S. model. So, so that's my question for you, and maybe I'll ask Bill, and you pose the question for you, and then we'll go back to you. So the question for you is, you got, at the end, you mentioned the Arms Trade Treaty briefly, and I wanted to ask you about that. In the earlier panel, we were talking about how do you uphold and reinforce norms. And so I was wondering, in your view, does the Arms Trade Treaty sort of had the effect of providing any new norms that we can use, for example, for holding countries accountable for what the weapons they're providing to Saudi Arabia? Or on balance, is, you know, in your view, has that been a relatively weak treaty? I mean, does it facilitate activism in terms of holding countries accountable? That is, you know, if we're trying to hold the United States accountable for the weapons it's supplying to Saudi Arabia, what, in your view, is the sort of strategy? Does the Arms Trade Treaty provide a kind of hook for that, or not? Hugh.
Okay, you didn't ask me one question, you asked me three. So I guess I'll answer all three. So the first question I got was, how extensive is this Orientalist discourse? And, you know, my sense of ideologies is that it's hard to sort of map exactly how extensive they are. It's in the nature of ideologies that sometimes they appeal to the people that they oppress. I mean, there are lots of working class people who buy into neoliberal discourse. Not as many as upper middle class people, but still there are some. So the Orientalist discourse, I would say, is sort of headquartered in the nuclear powers, especially the US and the UK. And most of the examples of it I found come from defense intellectuals in the US and the UK, pundits in the US and the UK. But certainly you'll find it in parts of the developing world as well. I think that there has been a softening of the Orientalism in the US and the West recently. Since the end of the Cold War, it's become harder to justify these large stockpiles that the US and other nuclear powers have. And the non-aligned countries have been very effective in the UN and other fora in pushing back and asking what entitles the nuclear powers to keep breaking Article 6. And even if they haven't got as much media attention as they might in the US, they have in other parts of the world. And so I have noticed that when I go to events around Washington at the think tanks, that there is an acknowledgement that I wouldn't have seen 10 or 15 years ago, that there is this critique. It's always dismissed. It's always said, you know, our nuclear umbrella protects these countries. They'd feel tempted to go nuclear if we didn't protect South Korea and Japan and so on. But the critique is at least acknowledged by people at CSIS and Brookings and so on, in a way it used not to be. The second question I heard is, what is the counter-discourse? I think a large part of the counter-discourse has to do with something I didn't mention in my remarks, which has to do with the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war. And so the last 10 or 15 years have seen extensive studies by people in public health and medicine and other fields as well about what would happen if even quite small numbers of nuclear weapons were used. You know, say if India and Pakistan used all of their nuclear weapons. And the simulations suggest that the consequences would be devastating, not just for the countries where the weapons exploded. You might have 2/3 of the world's crops failing because of all the soot in the atmosphere, stopping crops from growing. Of course, you'd have the fallout that would keep circling the globe, creating a sort of slow death epidemic of cancer in the long term. And so I think other countries have started to use this discourse of the humanitarian consequences of nuclear war to say this isn't just your business. If you ever use these weapons, we're facing kind of mini genocide of our own as well. Then the third question you asked is about India, and I guess I'm going to push back at you a little bit here about India being responsible. I had a field day collecting American public commentary on India's nuclear tests when they happened. And India was not cut a break. I mean, there was all this stuff about, these people, they can't afford to feed their own country, their own people. Why are they lavishing these resources on nuclear weapons? It's outrageous. They should solve the problem of poverty first. I remember particularly a column by Mary McGrory, an alleged liberal columnist in the Washington Post. And she said, India thinks it's joined the nuclear club. We should make it clear to this upstart nation that they're not a member of any civilized club whatsoever. And that's more or less an exact quote from her column, right?
People say that to me a lot, too.
Now, people said similar things about China when it crossed the nuclear threshold. So there is this phenomenon that at first when countries acquire nuclear weapons, there's this attitude of horror from the established members of the club, and then over time they get used to the nouveau riche, the nouveau nuclear, and they accept them as members of the club, and that has happened with India. I think particularly in reward for India joining the global neoliberal regime and giving up its sort of neo-socialist pushback against that. Hasn't happened so much with Pakistan, which is interesting.
Well, I got one question, which is good. So the Arms Trade Treaty, on the one hand, was an accomplishment of global civil society. People didn't think it could be done. There was all kinds of opposition from the major players. During the Bush administration, the U.S. delegation to the talks would often include, they'd be arm in arm with an small arms industry executive. There was this ubiquitous guy from the NRA, which had taken a position against the treaty because they felt like control anywhere will seep back into control in the United States, and the UN will come in black helicopters and take our guns away. The fact of getting it done, I think, was important. It mostly codifies things that existed in international law or U.S. law or elsewhere. And in fact, when the U.S. finally came around, their position was, we're bringing other countries up to our standards. We set the gold standard. Other countries need to come up to that. That was their argument for shifting gears and supporting it during the Obama years. But the problem is it's not really enforceable. So it really comes back to, does it add an additional consciousness and norm that people can use in campaigning within their own countries to change government policies? So maybe there's some analogy to the nuclear weapons ban in that respect, in that you don't have a club to hold over the countries. And I think the UK case is discouraging because they're a signatory, and it seemed like a pretty clear case, and they couldn't win that in court. Of course, there's a lot of things driving the trade to Saudi Arabia, including money, and that's been exacerbated or intensified or accelerated under Trump. And it's interesting because we had a vote to try to block a sale of precision-guided munitions, which got 47 votes in the Senate, which is an improvement, but still we lost. And some of the arguments on the other side were about jobs, but of course, this deal was worth $1 billion, which for you and me is a lot of money. But compared to $115 billion in the pipeline, it was less than 1%. So there was no way on earth that stopping that deal was going to have a big impact on the job effects in the United States of the U.S.-Saudi arms trade. But it was used as an argument. Likewise, under the new MBS plan for Saudi Arabia for 2030, they want to produce more and more of the content of the weapons they buy in Saudi Arabia. They're aiming for 50%. It's now 2%. Or, Trump was in Japan bragging about selling them F-35s, how great it was for American jobs. They're going to build an assembly plant in Japan to assemble those F-35s. So, if anything, the jobs will be there in terms of manufacturing. So the economic argument doesn't hold up to scrutiny in many ways, but it's quite potent in terms of driving sales. Also, I would think in the UK, where they've had big scandals about bribery and sales of fighter planes and other things, and Tony Blair blocked the inquiry because he said their relationship with Saudi Arabia was more important than pursuing this corruption investigation. So I think there's still a lot of factors that have to be dealt with that a treaty alone can't really get at.
In regard to Bill's talk, could I just tell a quick
course, yeah.
story that's somewhat relevant? You know, I noticed that all your sources are outside academia, which is not a critique of the talk, it's a critique of academia, that academics are not really tracking this in such a way. But a few years ago, I was on a selection committee for an organization I won't name that was giving out money for peace and security research. And the proposal I thought was the best proposal before us was on the small arms trade of guns in particular, trying to get global estimates of flows between different countries and to write a protocol small arms control treaty. And it looked pretty good for the proposal until one person on the panel said, if this is funded, the NRA really won't like it. And that was it. It was dead. This was an organization that gets some of its money from the US government. That killed the proposal.
And some of it is people having the same positions as the NRA. A lot of it is people fearing the NRA. That, why get it? Why pick this fight? But either way, the result is the same.
Wow. Okay. The floor is open. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. This was very enlightening for me, looking at especially the trade, the weapon trades story. And I'm wondering, so you focused mostly on the Saudi Arabia, the U.S. kind of weapon deals. I'm wondering if you can say a few words on the Balkan shipments that have been going to Syria and kind of the fueling of the conflicts in Syria, and how does that map out in the stories of movement of weapons across north and south?
It seems to be incredibly significant, and I actually learned mostly from this work of the Balkan Investigative Research Network, Reporters Network, because and the U.S. plays a role in the Syria case because the weapons are procured in the Balkans, but it's U.S. money, and of course large industries were built up there during the Soviet period, and there was a time when a lot of the illicit sales to places like Sierra Leone and elsewhere were based on former Soviet stockpiles and middlemen from the region and so forth. This seems to be a bit more regularized. It's governments without these kind of shadowy middle persons, and the kind of things they're selling seem to be quite relevant to the immediate fight. Small arms and light weapons primarily. So I think the impact is quite large. I mean, for a while there was a plan to train and equip the moderate democratic Syrian forces from a U.S. pot of money, and they couldn't find people who were moderate enough for their tastes, and they couldn't train them quickly enough, and the program collapsed. And that was about a $500 million program. And so they said, all right, well, let's not do it that way. Let's just arm people who are fighting on the ground now. And that's when this $2 trillion plan to buy weapons primarily from the Balkans to transfer to U.S. allies in Syria was hatched, with very little discussion that I know of in Congress or elsewhere until this research was done. So I think it's indicative of the value of staying after these things. And they have quite impressive network. They have journalists on the ground in the region. They're looking at multiple governments, so they learn some things in Serbia, some things in the U.S., some things from reporters on the ground. They're tracking shipping documents and looking for discrepancies and letters of transit and so forth. So it's I'd say among the more important kinds of research that's been done lately, and I'm just kind of scrambling to catch up even with their findings, and how they went about it.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. So I had two questions. One is a slightly longer one, which is that I was interested in what you were saying about this sort of way in which nuclear Orientalism falls into this sort of East-West or developing and developed countries, and who kind of monopolizes the conception of civility. And it kind of reminds me of how even at Copenhagen the environmental discourse kind of panned out with the irony not being lost on anyone that the very countries that are now presuming to impose controls on on pollution are the ones that have had the largest history of polluting, right? And that is sort of the argument that the Indian government had made at Copenhagen too, that per capita even though India is a highly polluting country, per capita pollution levels are lower, much lower, in fact, than the United States. Now, one of the problems with that kind of argument, I mean, as a sort of general, broad anti-imperialist gesture, I think that's an interesting position to have, but it kind of falls into nationalist frames again, right? So, India represents one bulwark of a rising nuclear power, the US or developed countries another. And it kind of falls into nationalist frames because there is actually a vibrant debate within India as to why is it a country that cannot feed its poor? Why do they invest in? Why are we investing in a nuclear program? And is it possible to kind of move the conversation on nuclear proliferation to talk about, to kind of have a transnational activist movement? I know that does exist, and that was sort of my question, which is that, is it possible to kind of think transnationally about what an anti-nuclear weapons movement might look like, so that we think of nuclear weapons as a status discourse fundamentally, because as you yourself said, historically it's never emerged out of democratic dialogue with people. And what would that kind of look like? A nuclear proliferation as a people's discourse rather than as a state discourse. The other small question that I had was, I was struck by what you were saying about chemical and biological weapons being the poor man's weapon, and how these have been the ones to be regulated. And I was wondering how you would then, that's an interesting kind of political economy sort of take on what is often, on a debate about nuclear weapons, it's often kind of becomes about normative idealism, right? That it's morally wrong, it somehow commands a certain moral urgency to ban. And so I wanted to ask you, is that really the sort of undergirding factor, the fact that it's easier to regulate, the fact that it becomes a way to police countries that are non-nuclear states from having weapons of mass destruction, or is it something else? Thank you.
Okay. So to take the first question about the danger of a critique of Orientalism falling into nationalist frames, and so you get an erasure of anti-nuclear activists in India. In the article I referenced that I published in Cultural Anthropology, there's a section at the end where I ask about the implications of sort of spotlighting Orientalism as a problematic discourse. And I try and transpose it into more of a transnational key there, and say that one way of looking at it is that we keep accusing other countries of things that we're guilty of. I mean, we have an epidemic of homelessness in the United States, but we spend all this money on nuclear weapons, right? So why are we pointing the finger at India for not solving its problems of poverty when we haven't solved our problems of poverty? We talk about nuclear weapons being in dangerous hands in India, that they don't have proper procedures for making sure that they're technically safe from theft. You know, the US a few years ago lost track of a dozen nuclear weapons for a day. It loaded them on a plane, flew them across the country, and no one knew where they were. They weren't supposed to be on the plane. The crew didn't know they were flying nuclear weapons, right? So I try and say that the critiques that we make of them, they could make of us, and surely that might lead in the direction of a transnational movement to get rid of nuclear weapons. But in my sort of telescope comments here, that aspect of it didn't come through. You did say that there's never been a democratic debate in any country about crossing the nuclear threshold. The one country of which that might not be true actually is India, because the BJP did run on a platform that it wanted to go fully nuclear, and they won the election, right? So you could argue that India is the only country that has ever acquired the consent of its populace to cross the nuclear threshold. Then your second question about why was it possible to ban chemical and biological weapons. I mean, in terms of the special interests that they mobilized in the US, it's a fraction of the special interests that have their hooks into the nuclear weapons business, from Lockheed Martin to major nuclear weapons labs at the University of California that's managed the labs. I mean, just Bechtel, every major corporation has an interest in the existence of nuclear weapons in a way that wasn't true for chemical and biological weapons. And I think it was possible for the Americans and the Soviets to agree on banning them because they could see it would be a nightmare if they ever used them against each other. They had plenty of conventional weapons that were more controllable on the battlefield. And if you legitimize the weapons by having enormous stockpiles in the US and in Russia, it was just an invitation for developing countries to get the weapons and maybe use them against the US in some context, right? I mean, the US was very nervous that Saddam Hussein might use chemical weapons in the Gulf War against American troops, and rehearsed for that and had prophylactic measures for US troops, right? So you can see from the point of view of interventions in the Middle East and other parts of the world, why the US and the Russians would have an interest in making sure that chemical and biological weapons just don't exist.
Yes.
I have a question to both of you. Mr. Hartung, why did you call your book Prophets of War instead of Prophets in War? And to Professor Gusterson, would you talk a little bit about the love affair between the military and tactical nuclear weapons?
Well, it was my agent's idea. But to the extent that there was any justification, there's a thread that runs through it of the role of arms contractors in shaping the discourse that leads war to be more likely, funding right-wing think tanks and lobbying for certain weapon systems and so forth. So it was sort of, for example, the Project for the New American Century, which kind of set the table for the Bush invasion of Iraq. Their director for a while was a vice president from Lockheed Martin. Many of the think tanks that beat the drums for war were funded by contractors, and they were sort of like, it was sort of like political money laundering. Like, it's better to have this seemingly objective group, pushing for war than perhaps the head of Lockheed Martin would not be as credible, if they were out there pushing. So it was based in that. It might still be a stretch, but that was sort of the idea.
So in terms of the military's love, as you put it, of tactical nuclear weapons, I wouldn't say that all the military loves tactical nuclear weapons, but there are elements of it that are certainly infatuated. So there's a more and a less paranoid version of this as an analysis. What troubles the military is that nuclear weapons are so awful that threats to use them may not be credible, right? They become sort of self-deterring. And the military doesn't like to have weapons that it can't credibly threaten to use or can't credibly use. So if you want the more paranoid version is they really want to find a usable nuclear weapon. And if the yield is very small, or if it's like the neutron bomb, where there's a burst of neutrons that kills tank drivers and so on, and then you can occupy the nuclear battlefield, then that's the military's dream, a weapon that they can actually use that the adversary might not have. The less paranoid version is that they don't intend to use the weapons, but they want the threat to use them to be credible. And so they're worried that something of the enormity of a Minuteman, it's just not credible that you would use it because of the enormous civilian casualties. Whereas if there's a crisis in Korea, in the Taiwan Straits, it might be more believable if you have tactical nuclear weapons with a yield smaller than the Hiroshima bomb that you could threaten to use. And so some of the weapons in the stockpile, like the B-61 bomb, for example, that would be dropped from a bomber, has a dial yield component. So if you dial it up to the top of the dial, thinking of it like a toaster dial, it would be many, many times the yield of Hiroshima. But if you dial it down to the low end, I think it's just 3 kilotons or something like that.
Nervous. Thank you. These were really excellent presentations. Thank you. So my question, Bill mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that there's not a lot of funding on this issue, and then you brought up the example of the NRA, he brought up the example of the NRA in that panel. So, one of the things as I've been digging more and more into all of this work is that there is a lot to be studied, and yet there doesn't seem to be a lot of focus beyond sort of the nuclear stuff on more of the chemical and biological weapons uses. I'm sure parts of it has to do for ideological purposes from some of these, lobbying organizations or institutions that are involved. So just sort of I'd love to hear more about that and how you think that affects future research and future projects that look into these issues. And also, sort of related, what do you both think about the contractors or the sort of private armies and their involvement in the trade of these sorts of weapons? And how is that, if it's so difficult to track from a state's perspective, then what happens when we're sort of looking at that level?
Yeah. Well, the private contractors sort of peaked at the peak of the Bush intervention in Iraq because they had 160,000 troops there, and they had contractors doing everything from doing the laundry to guarding pipelines to running around with guns like Blackwater did. It was said that there was at the peak one contractor employee for every soldier. A lot of those were locals who were hired to do some of this logistical work. The actual gun-toting ones might have been 5, 6, 7,000. So those companies are actually kind of scrambling around a bit because they don't have quite the big cash cows they had in Afghanistan and Iraq. In fact, the guy who used to run the International Peace Operations Association, which is what they call the private contractor lobby, was asking me about jobs. Not to work with me, but just in general. But as a result, they're trying to do, like they get contracts with the UN to protect things and with humanitarian groups, and they're trying to get into domestic security in the U.S. And so they're trying to find different ways at it. And the head of Blackwater has reemerged in the UAE. He was involved in some sort of deal to help the UAE secure mercenaries from Latin America to fight in Yemen. Since the Times broke the story, I haven't seen a lot about what are those mercenaries doing, and are there mercenaries from elsewhere that are also involved? And Prince also wrote an op-ed saying we should let private contractors run the entire U.S. side of the Afghanistan war. And so, in a way, it's like you can buy arms or you can buy an army. So it's for certain countries this is a very attractive option, except you can't necessarily control them once you've signed on the dotted line. So what was the first?
The question of funding and knowledge production. So like when we're talking about an issue like warfare, where there's a lot of profit to be made on the selling part and on how does that then affect knowledge production on our end, on the research end, about about these issues?
Well, I think without alienating any potential funders, I would say, which is another restraint that we have. Part of it is compartmentalization. Like some funders have decided we care about nuclear security, and we're going to fund scientists to look at nuclear security, and that's going to be our contribution. Or some of my funders, it's like, well, we only work on the Pentagon budget, but we don't work on nuclear weapons because there's a foundation over here that does that. And also the resources are not comparable. I mean, if you're at Heritage and you've got these right-wing foundations writing you huge checks, plus corporations, plus foreign governments, you just got a lot more resources. I mean, a lot of the research is crap, pardon my language, but nonetheless, they have a big megaphone. But I think we can accomplish a fair amount. I mean, I think funders do need to be encouraged to look at this as a valuable enterprise. Also, it's one of these things that is a long-term project. And some funders like to say, well, what have you achieved, this year and this year and this year? These things you would be building over time. So you couldn't necessarily say at the end of a year, oh yeah, we stopped this or we did that. But that's the kind of investments that are needed. I mean, in my own case, I had to, for some years, just do it on my own, sort of as a hobby. I would write articles at night, and then I got a MacArthur writing grant to do my first book. And I left a somewhat comfortable government job to work on this stuff. I gave myself a goal of raising $100,000, which in the 90s was real money, and for me anyway. And I did in about 3 months, and I've been doing this ever since. But I assumed it would be about a 3-year time horizon, and then I'd have to get a real job. But it's been enough to kind of carry through, but I've kind of shifted focus. The actual luxury of looking at the arms trade as a major part of my workday is only recent. But I think we have to make a case to the funders, but also we just have to find a way to do the work regardless, and I think that can still be powerful.
So in regard to the contractor question, I have a slightly different cut into it through the nuclear weapons complex. So during the Cold War, this was the situation with regard to the nuclear weapons complex. There were 2 weapons labs at Los Alamos and Livermore, and they were both managed by the University of California. They were solely managed by the University of California. By the end of the Cold War, the University of California was earning $16 million a year for doing that, but they claim that much of that money went back into the labs. So they basically did it as a public service. They didn't make much of a profit. Places like the Rocky Flats facility that made the nuclear triggers was run by Rockwell, but they were paid $1 a year to do it. They did it as a public service. So that was the situation during the Cold War. Now the situation is this. Under the George W. Bush administration, the weapons labs were taken away from the University of California and put out for bid. And a consortium that does include the University of California as a minor player, but Bechtel as the dominant player, that consortium now manages both nuclear weapons labs. It earns $60 million a year for managing the weapons labs. It used to be the case that the director of the weapons lab, which is a demanding job, being a director of a lab that handles very dangerous material with 10,000 employees, they used to earn about $150,000 a year. They now earn closer to $1 million a year, and the director is the CEO of this corporate consortium of contractors, right, as well as being the director of the lab. And Bechtel at Los Alamos and Livermore has moved this phalanx of middle managers in there that have taken control of the lab. The weapons designers hate them. They hate this new regime. They feel that they've lost their freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of inquiry under this sort of heavy Bechtel blanket. And they feel that surplus value is being sort of extracted from the labs. Bechtel will send these middle managers there to sort of learn the stuff, and then they deploy them to other Bechtel facilities, and they can strip the knowledge out of Los Alamos and Livermore and take it with them to monetize it for other Bechtel endeavors. So it's something that hasn't been much written about in the mainstream media, but there is a very different kind of contractor story for the weapons labs that's disturbing in its own way. And Los Alamos, if any of you have been following, has had a slew of safety accidents, including the unplanned explosion of the waste isolation pilot project, the underground waste facility. Los Alamos had not packaged the drums of waste properly. They put organic instead of inorganic kitty litter around the waste, and it caused an explosion that has closed the facility down and cost $6 billion, I'm told, at this point. And that packaging facility was run by a different contractor at Los Alamos, right, that was interested in profits and speed. And, doing my field work, I've heard some horrifying stories about that packaging facility from people in the lab who said, I don't like to tell an outsider about this, but, it's kids with high school degrees, Hispanic kids from Española with high school degrees. They've got these Bechtel and other managers standing over them saying, faster, 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 profits are at stake. And what they do, they've got these big barrels, and there are these huge clumps of nuclear waste they work on in glove boxes because there's plutonium in there, and they're working on them with hammers and pickaxes to try and break them down and cram them into these boxes, these barrels that get filled with kitty litter and sealed and then shipped to southern New Mexico. And it's no surprise, given what I heard, that things weren't being done properly there.
One more, do we have time for one more question? Okay.
Thanks so much for these really interesting presentations. I have a question and a comment. Hugh, I also am going to ask more about this, about nuclear Orientalism. And I'm sort of interested if you think that the Orientalist hypothesis also applies to conventional weapons. And given what Bill also told us about the role of Saudi Arabia and the UAE in the arms trade, and then of course like this almost total media silence on the Saudi bombing in Yemen in the US and in the Western press more generally. I wonder if that in any way complicates this idea of the Orientalist hypothesis. So just if we could think a little bit about that. And then my comment, just in response to how certain weapons become illicit. So I've done a bunch of research on the use of cluster bombs in the south of Lebanon, and if you look at the human rights reports, or the reports of human rights organizations, the things that they're really concerned about is, of course, the kind of excess amount of the weapon that was used, but it's really the failure rates that trigger the cluster bombs as problematic status. And when you actually read the fine print on the Convention on Cluster Munitions, they really only want to ban the kind of cluster munitions that have high failure rates. So, so it's this interesting thing about like how perceptions of what is like normative, like function and failure in weapons also plays into what kinds of weapons get to be considered illicit. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
So the question about whether it applies to conventional weapons is an interesting one I haven't thought about, and so thank you for prompting me to do so. And I'm not going to give you a very good answer because I need more time to think about it. So just some random thoughts. One is that nuclear weapons have a special status because of their awesome destructive power, and they have a special status as stratifying objects, right, as status objects. It's no coincidence that the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council are also the 5 countries recognized by the Non-Proliferation Treaty as legitimate possessors of nuclear weapons, right? And so the Orientalist discourse sort of guards that privilege ideologically in a way, whereas allowing Saudi Arabia to have F-16s is kind of irrelevant to that. The other random thought I have is that in some ways the US and other Western powers rely on other countries to do their dirty work for them as proxies, right? And so there may be a sort of subterranean Orientalism there. You know, they don't respect human rights, and so we'll allow them to fight Yemen in a way that we're too civilized to do, right? We saw this with the death squads in Central America in the 1980s, that American troops would not do that dirty work, but it was farmed out to the Guatemalans and the Salvadorans. So there may be a way in which there's sort of a ricochet effect, if you like, from the Orientalism, that you can use those dirty countries to do dirty work. And as with all ideologies, it can be invoked and then suppressed, right? So you can apply it selectively to some countries, why they shouldn't be allowed certain weapons, but conveniently suppress it for countries that are your allies, as we did with Iran or in Iraq.
Okay. Did you want to say anything to that?
I had one thing.
Hold on one sec. We'll let him respond to that.
The cluster munitions thing. It's really, they were viewed as indiscriminate weapons, not because of what happens when you drop them on people, but because of the aftermath of the unexploded ordnance, which then can kill civilians for years thereafter. So it was an interesting distinction. It's like if you get them the first time, it's fine. It's really the next step that we find objectionable, you know.
I was also interested in that nuclear Orientalist theory that you presented, and I was wondering, do you think this applies to the to nuclear energy as well? Because it is governed by, for nuclear new build projects, the IAEA dual use argument is being used. I don't know. I'm just wondering.
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I have some inner knowledge of the workings of the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, which meets with other countries that want to acquire nuclear reactors and gives them advice on nuclear regulations. And I know that at the higher levels of that organization, there was a very sort of pseudo-Orientalist discourse about countries that can and can't be trusted. If African countries wanted nuclear energy, that would make the Nuclear Regulatory Commission very uneasy. Right? And it's not just about the proliferation risk, it's about the safety issue. That certain countries can't be trusted with that technology to use it safely. unrationally.
Okay, well, I think we're at the end of our session here, so please join me in thanking our panelists for very stimulating discussions.
Just a really quick announcement. Thank you so much for this great panel. So lunch is served and everyone is invited. The third floor, the Kim Library, which is on that side of this building on the third floor.